Chapter 1904. Fawn color equals red, squinting eyes face B. On the bright moon, Luo Fan felt the entire bright moon start to tremble violently. An extremely terrifying power started to explode in the depths of the moon, and it was about to completely reveal the changes that he had been suppressing for a long time. In the face of such a change, his eyes narrowed, and his own sense of existence rose once more. He used a mysterious, even metaphysical method to suppress it. Under the suppression of his terrifying presence, the explosion was slowly calmed down. Although it did not disappear, it suddenly extended backwards. The change that was originally about to erupt was pulled back to a few hundred years later. I can't do it now. After suppressing this with his presence, Luo Fan's face was filled with inexplicable fatigue. Using his presence to suppress some kind of fundamental change in the world was equivalent to using his own body to resist the world. It was extremely difficult and exhausting. Even he could not help but feel tired. However, this process wasn't without any benefits for him. In fact, using his own sense of existence to resist the changes in the world was like a form of polishing and refining his own sense of existence. Just the years of resistance had already allowed him to have a deeper understanding of his own sense of existence. His control over his own sense of existence was also incomparable to before. In fact, even his view of the world seemed to have faintly undergone some mysterious and subtle improvements because of this change. It was precisely because of this that he was so hell-bent on carrying out this kind of suppression. Otherwise, he would not have gone to this extent, even though he would have taken action based on his support for Hunku at the same time. Under the ground, above the core of the underworld, Sky Maiden, who was suppressing the core of the underworld in an alternate timeline, also reacted. The terrifying changes that erupted from the core of the underworld almost overturned her, and she had no choice but to completely unleash her power. Countless runes transformed into 7-colored rays of light and poured into it. Using the method of moving 1,000 kilograms with great difficulty, he guided the changes in it towards a complicated, meticulous, and yet slow direction. In the end, she only managed to suppress this eruption with great difficulty. However, compared to Luo Fan, who could suppress it for hundreds of years, she could only suppress it for a few decades at most. From this aspect, it was enough to show that there was still a gap between her and Luo Fan. After suppressing everything, the Space Lady in a different timeline raised her head and looked upward. Her eyes seemed to be able to see through the endless strata. In the boundless space, he saw Luo Fan on the bright moon. The moment she saw him, the Space Maiden in the alternate timeline could not help but feel astonished. That kind of ease, that kind of casualness, that kind of strength, were all beyond her imagination. As expected of my Tao companion from a different timeline. This thought suddenly flashed through his mind. At this moment, Luo Fan seemed to sense her gaze and opened his eyes. His gentle gaze pierced through the endless void and the earth, shining directly on her body, making her feel an indescribable power emerging from her heart. He smiled faintly. She closed her eyes again and began to gather her power to suppress the underworld. At this moment, although Luo Fan did not know what she was thinking, he only smiled and turned his attention to the bright moon. While there were such inexplicable changes in the sky and on the ground, the war on the ground had already developed in full swing. Just now, when the emperors were meeting, it was Hunku who launched the war machine of the entire Celestial Empire. She brazenly sent troops and completely engulfed the hundreds of empires. Her territory was completely included in the Celestial Empire. The reason why it was so easy was that the hundreds of empires were originally used by the emperors as a buffer zone with the Celestial Empire. After conquering these empires, the territory of the Celestial Empire had been increased, but at the same time, it had lost the buffer zone, allowing her to finally face the truly powerful empires. As the various emperors came up with various topics, the many empires in the entire world seemed to have truly merged into one. all of their power began to link up to deal with the attack of the Celestial Empire. Their resistance was many times stronger than the hundreds of empires that had been conquered in a short period of time. The real tragic war broke out because of this, and the killing was carried out on a scale that was hundreds of times stronger than before. Just as the emperors knew, Hun Kuo had already thrown caution to the wind. The current situation was barely acceptable for the emperors, but for her, it was like a blunt knife that was constantly cutting her flesh. Therefore, she would rather die in battle than maintain the current situation. Although the overall strength of the empires was many times stronger than the Celestial Empire, the Celestial Empire was still complete, while the empires were divided into nearly 100,000. Separated, no matter how much power flowed, no matter how closely they united, they couldn't compare to a complete one. Therefore, even if the emperors had now determined the method to unite and worked hard to cooperate with each other, in the end, they still couldn't fully display the overall strength of all the empires. In this way, the battle would no longer be as one-sided as it was in the normal comparison of strength. The battles among the empires were extremely tragic. Occasionally, the Celestial Empire would conquer those empires and integrate them into itself. However, after a while, the allied forces of the empires would tear the Celestial Empire apart again, tearing some empires apart and stripping away the previous achievements of the Celestial Empire. It was like a seesaw, with ups and downs, coming and going. However, in terms of the overall situation, the Heavenly Empire still had the upper hand. Its territory was continuously growing and expanding. The reason for this was none other than the fact that as the many rulers worked together for a longer period of time, they had unknowingly started to scheme against each other. All sorts of actions that hindered the Heavenly Empire were gradually being carried out. Among them, the ones who contributed the most were, of course, the emperors whose empires were conquered and who had lost their own empires. Because of this disunity, the Celestial Empire had an opportunity to take advantage of. As a result, the Celestial Empire gained more and more of an upper hand. 10 years later, the Shura Emperor said coldly, "This won't do." After 10 years of tragic war, the number of emperors here had decreased by nearly 30%. In other words, 30% of the empires had been conquered by the Celestial Empire. It had already been conquered by the Celestial Empire. The Celestial Empire had grown from the original size of 1/20th of the world to a terrifying size of nearly 1/3. It really won't do. Our strength is too scattered. If this continues, what awaits us next will be the Celestial Empire breaking us apart and devouring us. Another emperor said at this time. Hearing this, the expressions of the other emperors turned ugly. To be able to stand out among the many emperor candidates and conquer many other emperors, reaching this step, the emperors here. Which one of them could be a fool? How could they not see this fact? However, it was one thing to see it. What they were willing to do was another matter. Do you mean to say that we should really merge into one empire? One of the emperors broke the last layer of window paper. Hearing this, the Shura Emperor nodded and said, "That's right. This is our only way out. If we don't really unite and form an empire, our strength will still be scattered. It's still impossible to fight against the Celestial Empire." A sneer came from the mouth of an emperor at this time. "Shura Emperor, what do you mean? Are you going to use this method to annex all of us?" "It's not that I want to annex all the empires for my own selfish reasons. But the situation is like this, we have to unite. If there is a majesty who thinks that he is stronger than me and has more power than me, then I am also willing to serve him as king," the Shura Emperor said calmly. As he spoke, an inexplicable awe-inspiring aura shot up into the sky. These words made the other emperors sneer. The Shura Emperor's empire was the strongest among all the empires. His own strength was also the strongest among all the emperors. For him to say such a thing was too hypocritical. "If you want us to submit to you for such a reason, we might as well submit to the Celestial Empire. Isn't she stronger than you, and isn't she more powerful than you? An emperor said coldly. His words were unanimously affirmed by the other emperors. These emperors all had a clear understanding of their own strength. They knew that if this empire really merged into one, they would have no chance of becoming the emperor of this great empire. Under such circumstances, there was no essential difference between joining this huge empire that was united by many empires and joining the Celestial Empire. They were both submitting to others and losing their own empires. In that case, submitting to a more powerful being was obviously a more correct choice. Upon hearing this, the Shura Emperor said, "Join the Celestial Empire? That woman is going to become a Celestial Emperor. If you join her, you will only push her toward becoming a Celestial Emperor. When she becomes a real Celestial Emperor, you will have no chance to turn things around. From then on, you will have to float under her throne forever. In comparison, if you join our side and pull that woman down, all of us will have a chance to become Celestial Emperors. Moreover, even if others become Celestial Emperors, you will still have a chance to turn things around because you are not strong enough. Don't you know how big the difference is?" Many emperors' expressions turned extremely ugly at this moment. Naturally, they had thought about what the Shura Emperor knew as well. Otherwise, they wouldn't have come here this time. Submitting to the Celestial Empire was indeed a better choice in the short term. However, it would be of greater help to the ruler of the Celestial Empire. It would allow the ruler to rise to a height that they couldn't even look up to. When that time came, they would have no chance to turn things around. In comparison, submitting to any of the emperors here would not allow them to become Celestial Emperors directly. They would definitely have to face one or more Celestial Emperor tribulations in the future, just like what the woman had encountered this time. This was their chance. However, even though logic told them to submit to any of the emperors here, it was better than submitting to the Celestial Empire. However, how could they make the decision to give up everything and submit to someone else so easily? "I have a suggestion." At that moment, an emperor who looked like an old man said with a smile. The Shura Emperor suddenly felt a little uncomfortable. He vaguely felt that the other party's suggestion would be extremely disadvantageous to him. However, at this moment, the other emperors had already locked their gazes on that emperor. Under such circumstances, if he were to stop them, he would incur the wrath of the crowd. Therefore, even though he felt uncomfortable in his heart, however, he could only say, "Please speak." The emperor smiled and said, "We must truly unite and form a nation. Only then can we truly resist the Celestial Empire. I believe that all of you emperors agree on this point." The emperors nodded. Their expressions were pensive. Since that's the case, then the foundation of this alliance has obviously been established. And now, our debate is obviously about who will be the ruler of this country, the leader of all of us. The emperors nodded again. The eyes of those who were quick-witted lit up slightly. Clearly, they had already guessed what the old man was going to say. At this moment, the Shura Emperor's expression became extremely unsightly. The uneasiness in his heart had reached its peak. "So, we don't need to establish an empire. Can't we just establish a republic?" "Don't tell me that you don't know what a republic is," the old man said. Hearing this, the other emperors showed a look of sudden understanding and joy. However, the Shura Emperor's expression became extremely unsightly. A republic's nation. It also had a leader and it also had a ruler. However, it was no longer absolute like an empire. It wasn't just a ruler. The leader was no longer fixed. Moreover, his authority was no longer omnipotent. However, there was a great possibility that he could be overthrown and replaced. Moreover, the emperors who weren't strong enough might one day be able to oust the ruler and sit on the throne themselves. "That's right. We must establish such a nation." One of the emperors laughed, echoing the old man. Hearing this, the other emperors also chimed in. In just a short while, Their voices had become the unanimous decision of all the emperors. Under such circumstances, even the Shura emperor, who was considered the strongest among the emperors, couldn't change the situation. He could only gnash his teeth and stare at the old man, his eyes filled with hatred. The old man was very pleased with himself. He laughed and looked at the Shura emperor. The old man's strength wasn't the strongest among the emperors, but he wasn't weak either. He had the chance to oust the ruler in the future and sit on the throne himself. As long as the Shura emperor didn't want to offend everyone and didn't want to face the celestial dynasty alone, he could only comply with the general trend and agree to the decision. The other emperors who had the chance to compete for the position of supreme emperor could only grit their teeth and agree to the decision. As they truly agreed, the Republic's nation started to be established at an extremely fast speed. In just one short year, the original boundaries between the tens of thousands of nations were completely broken. All the tens of thousands of empires formed a huge nation that was twice the size of the Celestial Dynasty. It was a republic. The tens of thousands of emperors formed a general assembly. The Shura emperor eventually became the ruler of the republic. In this republic, each ruler's term of office was 400,000 years. Each ruler could only serve 2 terms at most. After those 2 terms, they had to wait 40 million years before they could compete for the position of ruler again. Such a rule would reduce the value of a ruler to the lowest possible level. Greetings, ruler. At the first court meeting after the nation was established, many former emperors and current counselors started to pay their respects to the Shura emperor, who was also the current ruler. A strong wave of destiny gathered on the ruler's body, making him feel as though his cultivation realm was climbing rapidly. However, this feeling was indescribably vague. When he wasn't paying attention to it, this feeling would always be there, but when he intended to grab hold of this feeling and advance his own cultivation realm, he would realize that he was lacking something indescribably crucial, causing him to be unable to achieve this no matter how hard he tried. Damn it. If I really became the ruler of this nation, how could this have happened? The ruler's expression became extremely unsightly. An inexplicable murderous intent surged in his heart. The counselors' expressions didn't change when they sensed this murderous intent, but they all relaxed inwardly. After all, the ruler was an existence that had founded the strongest empire in the past. His control over his emotions was superb. He quickly suppressed the various negative emotions and began to consolidate the power of the entire nation, making arrangements to launch a real attack on the Celestial Dynasty. The degree of devastation wasn't as great as it had been in the past 100 years, but the threat to the Celestial Dynasty was several times greater. Thus, a war erupted. After suffering a real loss for the first time, Hun Ku, who was many times more profound than before on the altar of the Celestial Dynasty, had a faint smile on her face as she muttered, "Finally united? Looks like the chance to truly end this tribulation to become emperor has arrived." As she spoke, countless mysterious ripples continuously surged out from her body. Rumbling sounds appeared out of nowhere in the sky, as if countless lightning bolts were constantly exploding above her head. To be continued. Chapter 1905. Fawn color equals red, squinting eyes face B. After so many years of war, Hun Ku gradually understood that the upheaval of the world might have other meanings for other living beings. However, for her, this was her tribulation to become an emperor. As long as she could survive this tribulation, she would truly become the celestial emperor of this world. At that time, she would receive endless blessings from the world, and her cultivation realm would rise to an unimaginable height. She would even reach a point where she wouldn't be much weaker than her parents. However, if she couldn't survive this tribulation to become an emperor, then what awaited her would be death, her soul would scatter, and she would never be able to reincarnate. This kind of situation where one step in heaven and one step in hell made her both excited and nervous. It was precisely because of this that she had simulated the development of the tribulation to become an emperor countless times over the years. After repeated simulations, she had vaguely grasped the key and knew what to do in order to obtain the final victory and suppress the other emperors. Sensing the endless pressure that appeared out of nowhere in the void above her head, Hun-Ku only smiled faintly. With a slight thought, she issued a series of orders, which were transmitted to almost every location in the entire Celestial Empire and to almost all the fighting forces of the Celestial Empire. Following her numerous orders, the entire Celestial Empire was mobilized. Armies that had never appeared in the previous wars were mobilized and pounced on the newly established Celestial Empire from all directions. The combat power of this army that had been hidden for hundreds of years was several times stronger than the original combat power of the Celestial Empire. Those Celestial Empires had just been established and were in an unstable state. Coupled with the fact that they had already adapted to the original intensity of the battle, they couldn't react for a while. Very soon, the original area of hundreds of empires was completely conquered and included into the territory of the Celestial Empire. At this moment, the Shura Emperor, who was also the current ruler, finally reacted. In the midst of the anger in his heart, he began to issue orders one after another, mobilizing the overall strength of the entire Celestial Empire to gather at the place where the war had broken out, to resist the army of the Celestial Empire and try their best to repel the army. Unfortunately, although they had integrated into a whole Celestial Empire, they were still not an empire. Although the hegemon had great authority, the hegemon didn't care. But compared to the great power of the emperor, it was still far inferior. Hence, this kind of mobilization was unable to be done as freely as it was with his own empire. In the end, it was still a little too slow. It was impossible to form an effective resistance within a short period of time. Under the attacks of the Tian Empire's army, which had practically used all their trump cards, they began to retreat little by little. He was pushed back step by step. One by one, the original empires were conquered and cut off. Damn it! That woman took advantage of the fact that we haven't completely understood the rules to launch an attack. A councilman yelled in shock and anger. How could this be? We've clearly combined our powers, so why are we being pushed back? Another councilman shouted. These two councillors. They were all the emperors of the areas that had just been conquered by the Celestial Empire. Although their identities were different now, even if those territories had been conquered, they were still councillors, and their power and influence had not been reduced much. However, that was their territory after all. If they lost this territory, they would definitely lose it. It was equivalent to losing their foundation. For their actual strength, it was not a small amount of damage. It was precisely because of this. They were so excited just now, and they wanted to find the root cause so badly. It's the rules. The old emperor who had proposed to establish a republic before had an inexplicable look of regret on his face. He said so. The rules. The Shura emperor, who was also the current ruler, also had an extremely ugly expression on his face. He had just become the ruler not long ago, and he had not even digested the benefits he had obtained after becoming a ruler. He had not even been able to completely stabilize his cultivation realm, yet he had already suffered such a blow. This was simply like giving him a slap in the face. It would be strange if he could feel good about it. That's right. Because the previous war did not reflect it, we all unknowingly neglected that the foundation of our various countries was fundamentally based on that woman's methods. In other words, the reason we could become emperors was because of the rules she established. The old man said. In other words, now we are suffering from the backlash of the rules? The ruler said with an ugly expression. It's not a backlash, but our actions have already violated the foundation of the rules. The old man sighed. What kind of situation is this? Why are you still keeping us in suspense? A councilman said angrily. Upon hearing this, the old man said, The reason why all the countries in the world have appeared is because that woman wants to become a celestial emperor. Therefore, the foundation of all the superficial rules is that there must be an emperor. And now, we no longer have an emperor. This caused the conference hall to fall into a deathly silence. These words were very unpleasant to the ears, and they made people very angry. However, they had to admit that it made sense no matter how they looked at it. Were there truly selfless people in the world who were completely considerate of the world and all living beings? There were, but there were definitely not many. This was especially true for the woman who had declared from the very beginning that she wanted to become a celestial emperor and rule over the world. She definitely wasn't selfless and dedicated to all living beings in the world. How could such a person not have left a backdoor in the rules that she had created that would benefit her? Perhaps this is only your guess. One of the councilmen braced himself and said. These words were instantly met with the agreement of the other councilmen. These councilmen naturally didn't think that the old man was lying. Instead, they knew that they had no way out now. The current situation was the final outcome they could accept. No matter how they changed the current situation, it was no longer something they were willing to accept, after all. The most effective way to change the current situation and avoid the backlash of the rules was to change the republic into an empire. They would make that ruler the emperor of the empire. However, what was the difference between that and them directly submitting to that woman, who was also the celestial emperor? They would still have to submit to someone else, and they would also have an unparalleled existence above their heads. How could they possibly accept such a situation? Because of this, they had no choice but to force themselves to accept it. To support the current situation that they could barely hold on apart from the Shura Emperor, the other councilmen clearly had the same thought. Even the old man didn't say anything after making things clear. He didn't try to persuade them at all. Not long after, all the councilmen said in unison that it was just a wrong guess. The truth wouldn't be like that, and that they still had a chance of winning if they continued like this. When the ruler saw this, the rage in his heart almost made him explode. "Are you all going to just watch us fail like this?" he roared angrily. "Why do you say that, ruler?" another councilman asked. "Although we are at a disadvantage now, we are only at a disadvantage." But it was only a disadvantage. How could it be a defeat? This councilman was also the emperor of the territories that had been conquered. For him, right now, this country was his only hope. In this country, he was a councilman second only to the ruler. If he changed the country and lost his territories, what would he amount to? In this entire country, would there be any place for him to stand? It was precisely because of this that he decided to be resolute at this time. Facing such a councilman, the ruler instantly understood the other party's position, and his expression turned extremely unsightly. He snorted coldly and said, "Are you all going to be dragged down by him and die together?" "Let's surrender," one of the councilmen said. "Surrender?" When this was said, the other councilmen fell silent. This silence made the ruler unable to suppress his rage. His power erupted, and boundless divine light gushed out of his body. Thunder boomed in the void, and the ground shook continuously. The space and time were instantly torn apart by his power, and a terrifying might pressed down on the other councilman. "Humph!" the councilman snorted coldly. All sorts of powers erupted and surged. Waves of might wrapped around the power of the entire kingdom as they pounced towards the sovereign's might. They crushed the sovereign's might, causing the lightning in the void above to be instantly minced and dissipate into nothingness in the blink of an eye. The ruler was originally stronger than the other living beings, but in the end, he still couldn't compare to the combined power of the many living beings. Coupled with the support of the country itself, his power was greatly increased. However, the combined power of the councilmen easily neutralized it. At this moment, even though he was furious and wanted nothing more than to kill all of these people, he could only remain rooted to his spot, unable to move at all. Sir Ruler, I think that you have already lost your rationality and can no longer think clearly about the problem. Therefore, I suggest that we activate the Wartime Ruler Impeachment Act, a councilman said calmly. When he heard this, the ruler's face paled. He still had a chance to suppress everyone, but if his position as ruler was impeached, he would lose that chance. When that happened, wouldn't he be at the mercy of others? I'm done with this country. With a furious roar, the ruler took the initiative to disperse the support of the position of ruler. As he dispersed the blessing, the entire kingdom started to shake violently. An indescribable aura of destruction started to spread from this location to the entire vast kingdom. Shortly after, a large part of the country was cut off. The originally complete country became fragmented in the blink of an eye. As this happened, the power of the entire country started to weaken rapidly. Under the attack of the Celestial Empire, the retreat was getting faster and faster. The expressions of the councilmen in the conference hall changed drastically. Originally, their country still had some ability to resist. However, now that the ruler had flipped the table, the power of the country was naturally scattered like a plate of loose sand. In that case, the little bit of resistance they had had was completely taken away. "How dare you!" Furious shouts were heard in the ears of the ruler. The ruler only sneered and said, "I finally understand. What kind of ruler is this? He's just a marionette. You guys want it? Go and play by yourselves then." As he said that, his body trembled and a powerful aura surged out, suppressing the councilmen around him. Then, he turned into a streak of light and shot into the sky. He headed towards his own country. After getting rid of the ruler's position, although he still felt the powerful suppression, his mind felt relaxed. He felt a sense of comfort that he hadn't felt in a long time. It was as if he had gotten rid of some invisible shackles. He even vaguely felt as if he had comprehended something and his cultivation realm was about to increase once again. Indeed, the best thing to rely on is oneself. Placing your hopes on others is just too foolish. As this thought flashed through the Shura Emperor's mind, a sinister grin appeared on his face. Meanwhile, in the conference hall, the councilmen exchanged glances, not knowing how to react. The Shura Emperor's power was the strongest among all the emperors. It was also the largest among all the empires. Under the circumstances, without him, the power of the entire country would be greatly weakened. Furthermore, the fact that he had used such a crude method to betray the country had caused great harm to the country. Now, the overall strength of the country has been weakened once again. "Let's surrender," one of the councilmen said. "Surrender?" The other councilman pondered this. The current situation was, under such circumstances, none of the emperors could convince everyone else. Even if they promoted another ruler, the final outcome would be similar to when the Shura Emperor was still the ruler. In fact, the power of the entire country would be much weaker than before due to the loss of the Shura Emperor's power. Under the circumstances, there was no point in doing so. Surrendering is indeed a good choice. However, we need to think about how to surrender, another councilman said. Hearing this, the other councilmen exchanged glances. They could see the reluctance and helplessness in each other's eyes. Obviously, the councilmen still had some psychological barriers to surrendering. However, under the circumstances, it seemed like this was the only choice they could make in order to ensure their own rights in the future. At that moment, an urgent report came in. "Damn it! The Shura Emperor is so ruthless." Hearing the urgent report, many councilmen roared in anger. After the Shura Emperor had returned to his own empire, he had immediately mobilized his army to attack the other empires on the borders. He was actually about to conquer an empire. He must have been hiding his strength. Another councilman roared. This councilman was the emperor of the country that the Shura Emperor had attacked. To him, the current situation was the most critical moment. How could he not be anxious and furious? "All right, I suggest that Councilman Ji-chan be the ruler." At that moment another councilman said. Councilman Ji-chan was that old man. Hearing this, the other councilmen seemed to have woken up from a dream. Their eyes lit up and they actually unanimously recommended Councilman Ji-chan to be the ruler. Councilman Ji-chan was neither the strongest nor the weakest among the councilmen. He was at most in the middle. Whether it was from the perspective of strength or from the perspective of his own empire's forces, it was not his turn to be the ruler. If this country still wanted to achieve anything, it would obviously be like this. However, the reality was that they did not want this country to win at all. Instead, they wanted this country to surrender so that all of them could obtain the greatest benefits. Under such circumstances, having the strongest ruler who could raise the strength of this country to the highest level was obviously not very useful. A more useful method would obviously be to find a more intelligent councilman who could obtain more benefits for everyone to be the ruler. Councillor Ji-chan's intelligence had already been fully displayed previously, so how could he not know what everyone was thinking? He chuckled and nodded in agreement to the position of overlord. Then, in just a short 15 minutes, the second-generation ruler of this country was already in place. This entire process was countless times faster than when the Azura Emperor had become a ruler. It was also countless times smoother when the ruler took his place. The winds and clouds surged, and all sorts of strange phenomena appeared. Even though the entire kingdom was under attack from both sides, it was still brimming with vitality. The power gradually gathered together, forming an increasingly powerful combined force. Slowly, it began to show signs of harmony. Needless to say, this was the case. After Ji-chan was in place, he waved his hand and passed down a series of orders. The entire country was mobilized and began to set up layers of defenses to resist the attacks of the Celestial Empire and the Shura Emperor. For the Celestial Empire, this kind of defense could only delay their attacks. It could not make the attacks disappear. However, for the Shura Emperor, this kind of defense could completely suppress its attacks. After conquering an empire, it was powerless to continue and could only gradually withdraw. Chapter 1906. One side wanted to conquer, the other side wanted to surrender, and the weakest side wanted to resist. What could they do? At that moment, the world seemed to be fighting to the death, and the battle seemed to be even more intense than before. However, the overall situation was slowly changing. In the end, after several years, when the world seemed to have stabilized, the second-generation ruler of the Republic, who was also ruler Ji-chan, respectfully expressed his willingness to surrender to Hun-ku. With regards to such a development, Hun-ku was not surprised at all. After all, fighting was the best way to project one's thoughts. After experiencing so many years of battle, if Hun-ku still did not know what the other party was planning, then she would not be the Celestial Emperor. As for why the other party had fought for a few years before surrendering, she was very clear. It was nothing more than to show off his value and strength so that he could better negotiate with Hun-ku when he surrendered. As the entire country surrendered, the size of the Celestial Empire suddenly increased by 2 or 3 times, and the overall strength suddenly skyrocketed by several times. The moment the entire country was completely included in the territory of the Celestial Empire, Hun-ku, who was on the altar, began to emit an indescribable light. This light penetrated the void and rushed into the depths of the nomological laws, faintly resonating with the entire world. Vaguely, endless mysteries slowly emerged from her heart. Her path of cultivation was illuminated endlessly in this process. It began to grow at a crazy pace, climbing towards a peak that she had never imagined before. During this process there was an inexplicable obstruction. It appeared in her heart. This obstruction was like a jammer that constantly interfered with her thoughts, interfered with her improvement, and prevented her growth from being perfect. She faintly felt that she was running out of strength. This feeling was unbearable for Hun-ku. At this moment, she stopped the process of breaking through, suppressed the impulse to break through, and began to look in a certain direction. In that direction, It was none other than the country established by the Shura Emperor. After several years of development, the Shura Emperor's country had grown 2 or 3 times compared to before. This kind of growth was not considered small, but compared to the growth of the Celestial Empire. But it was completely unpresentable. The difference in overall strength was no longer something that could be reversed by 1 or 2 cultivators. At this time, Hunku's heart moved and a few orders were passed down. The power of the entire Celestial Empire began to be mobilized. Like a huge capstan, it began to gradually tighten, gradually strangling that country. This caused the territory in that country to be stripped off bit by bit and devoured bit by bit. In the following short period of 1 month, that nation finally couldn't take it anymore, and with a loud rumble, it completely collapsed. At this moment, the Shura Emperor roared, "I refuse to accept this. If it weren't for those trash, I wouldn't have ended up like this." In this loud roar, he burned everything in his body and turned it into an incomparably terrifying power. It tore through space and time, charging straight towards where Hunku was. The Ashura Emperor himself was already a supreme monarch. At this time, he completely gave up on everything. Burning everything, the power that erupted from it was several times stronger than the power of a supreme emperor. The power that erupted was so terrifying that it even caused the entire world to violently tremble. Time and space were shattered bit by the power, and the laws and laws were shattered into countless fragments. Wherever the power passed through, it was as if time and space had been completely shattered, completely collapsing and turning into a paste. That scene was so terrifying that even Hunku, who felt that her cultivation realm was constantly increasing, couldn't help but be secretly shocked. But at this time, I don't know, it's just me. Amidst her shock, this thought flashed through her mind. After completely shattering the Shura Emperor's country, the last obstacle to her becoming a heavenly emperor had been completely removed. Now, she only needed one last ceremony to truly become a heavenly emperor. In this way, it couldn't be any easier for her to mobilize the power of heaven and earth. Although the terrifying power that the Shura Emperor had turned into was extremely destructive and was enough to shatter everything, it was still in this world after all. In the end, it still had to face the suppression of all the nomological laws and all the power in this world. With a thought from Hunku, endless power and boundless might surged towards her from all directions and began to crazily smash against the power, trying its best to seal everything. In this way, the scene and the commotion were extremely terrifying, and it went without saying. It was as if half of the world was affected, and endless turbulence constantly appeared around the power. Countless spacetimes were born, and countless spacetimes were destroyed as the power surged. The nomological laws seemed to have turned into ordinary threads that were destroyed and rebuilt at will. This could be said to be the first time that the Celestial Empire had truly united the world. All the power, all the nomological laws, and all the forces in the entire Celestial Empire began to rapidly fluctuate at this moment. The hearts of the people gathered, and the power surged in the end. The terrifying attack that even surpassed the level of a supreme emperor was completely destroyed before it even entered the range that Hunku could see with her naked eye. Only a bit of the Shura Emperor's obsession was still surging and flying crazily. In the end, after crossing countless obstacles, it finally arrived in front of Hunku and appeared in front of the altar. To actually have such an obsession, what a pity! Looking at that bit of obsession, Hunku couldn't help but sigh. If such a strong-willed existence could obediently join her force, how useful would that be? It was a pity that he had thoughts of betrayal. I can't accept this. After seeing Hunku, that obsession only let out a sigh that shook the heavens and earth before gradually dissipating. It was after seeing Hunku. This obsession had truly been completed, but it could no longer possess the characteristic of being almost indestructible and invincible. As this bit of obsession was eliminated, the entire world began to tremble slightly. Boundless laws and laws began to circulate crazily at this moment, bringing with it a boundless and terrifying might. It began to form a perfect cycle, gradually surging between the world and gradually circulating. At this moment, Hun-Ku felt as though her state of mind had entered an unprecedented realm. In a trance, the meaning of this world to her was completely different from before. Before this, to her, this world was just something that could be used, something that only supported her existence. But now, this world seemed to have become her mother, her father, and the closest existence to her. Everything in this world seemed to have been opened up to her. She seemed to be able to use everything else in this world and all the mysteries to improve herself. To improve herself. She even felt that she seemed to be able to control this world, to carry out all kinds of incredible changes, at this moment. She also felt that Luo Fan and Sky Maiden, who had originally only been able to sense above and below the sky and below the ground, had directly seen the two of them. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was on the bright moon, sensed something and an inexplicable smile appeared on his face. At the same time, Sky Maiden, who was under the ground and in the alternate timeline, also sensed something. She also smiled faintly. As they sensed this, at the same time, they released their own suppression. As the two types of suppression relaxed, shocking changes occurred in both the upper and lower directions. The underworld, which had evolved in the core of the underworld for a long time and had been suppressed by Sky Maiden in the alternate timeline, suddenly exploded. Endless space-time, endless power, and endless nomological laws erupted from the core of the underworld. They surged wildly in all directions and gradually formed all kinds of indescribable connections with the world above the ground. The various nomological laws in the Celestial Dynasty began to rapidly penetrate the underworld. They began to participate in the composition of space-time, the composition of nomological laws, and even the composition of power. With these changes, once the underworld was completed, it would be affected by the nomological laws of the Celestial Dynasty and become a part of the Celestial Dynasty. It would not be like when the underworld was formed. Once it was formed, it would give birth to its own power to resist the Celestial Dynasty. In fact, this was also the fundamental reason why Sky Maiden in the alternate timeline had suppressed the underworld and waited until the Celestial Dynasty had completely unified the world before allowing it to erupt and truly evolve. This was because the underworld was the shadow of the world, the other side of the world. If the underworld truly evolved, the power it possessed would not be much weaker than the entire world, even if it could not compare to the entire world. At the very least, it would be many times stronger than any country in the world. If the underworld evolved before the Celestial Dynasty completely unified the world, due to the conflict between the nomological laws within the world, the underworld would become completely independent. At that time, the terrifying power born from the underworld would form its own entity and become the enemy of the Celestial Dynasty, becoming Hun-Ku's enemy. Once things developed to this point, Hun-Ku would not only have to deal with the resistance of the other countries in the world, but he would also have to deal with the resistance of the underworld and the various attacks launched from the underworld. In this way, even if Hun-Ku could emerge victorious, the already long process of conquest would be lengthened by more than 100 times. It was precisely because of this that Sky Maiden in the alternate timeline had been helping him suppress the underworld. After all, once the Celestial Dynasty completely unified the world, there would no longer be any conflict between the nomological laws within the world. Everything would be connected by the Celestial Dynasty's nomological laws. In that case, the nomological laws that were reflected when the underworld was born would naturally correspond to the nomological laws of the Celestial Dynasty. The underworld that was born naturally belonged to the Celestial Dynasty. Since it was born naturally, there would be no conflict between it and the Celestial Dynasty. In other words, not only did Hun-Ku not need to send the power to conquer it, but it could also become the power to conquer it. Looking at the change in the scene in front of her, an inexplicable smile appeared on the face of the Sky Maiden in the alternate timeline. Countless runes once again converged on her body, causing her body to gradually emit 7 colored rays of light. She looked like an incomparably sacred goddess. Suppressing the underworld for such a long time was not troublesome for the Sky Maiden in the alternate timeline, but it was also a kind of tempering for her cultivation path. Compared to Hunku, she had gained a lot less benefit. The benefits he obtained were a lot less, but he still obtained some benefits in the end. His own cultivation had been improved by a lot, and he faintly felt that he was already comparable to Luo Fan. Of course, it was the previous Luo Fan. Such a change had occurred in the underworld. It was also suppressed by the bright moon, which was suppressed by Luo Fan, but the change was even greater. The underworld had evolved directly from a core. It had evolved from nothing and was completely constructed according to the nomological laws of the world itself. However, that was not the case for the bright moon's change. At this moment, as the underworld changed, the bright moon shook and exploded with a loud bang. Endless lunar essence rapidly dispersed in all directions, scattering the sky in the blink of an eye. It felt as if the world was collapsing, and after the bright moon exploded, a black dot had appeared where the bright moon had originally been. This black dot. At first, it was a black dot that had no size and no interior. However, it seemed to surpass time. The instant the black dot appeared, it had already grown to the point where it blotted out the sky. It had completely covered the sky that had been scattered by the lunar essence of the lunar crescent. At this moment, the entire sky seemed to have been completely devoured by a black existence. It was an indescribable terror. A thought was born in the minds of the living beings below who had noticed this scene. Then, the black dot began to change rapidly. A world emerged from it. This world was extremely mysterious. To Luo Fan, it was a world that he was extremely familiar with. It was a world that he had entered once before, a world that possessed the will of the world. Now, the will of the world had even fused with the will of the world in this world. Yes, it was the world that had given birth to the bright moon and illuminated the moon. After this world appeared, the nomological laws within it directly clashed with the current nomological laws of the world. This conflict was so terrifying that the area where the two came into contact was completely shattered, causing time and space to completely collapse. Everything seemed to return to a state of chaos, turning into a hazy state. The nomological laws of the world originated from the Great World. In terms of level, they were vaguely higher than the nomological laws of the current world. However, it was a pity that the laws of heaven and earth were, on the whole, incomplete. Although it wasn't broken, there were still countless flaws in it. These flaws were nothing to living beings. They could still use the nomological laws of the world to do whatever they wanted. For example, they could increase their cultivation realm and their life's hierarchy. However, to the world, this kind of flaw was fatal. At that moment, the nomological laws of the world retreated bit by bit. They were attacked by the complete nomological laws of the world and started to twist and change. Gradually, they turned into a unique nomological law that was compatible with the nomological laws of the world. Along with this change, the chaos and annihilation that occurred at the point of contact between the world and this world gradually disappeared. The boundary between the two gradually calmed down. This calmness seemed to have turned into a boundless sea of clouds when one looked up from below. The changes in the world above were like the changes occurring in the world above the sea of clouds. At this moment, Luo Fan was at the boundary between the two. In other words, he was above the sea of clouds. He looked up at the world in front of him and looked down at the world below the sea of clouds. All kinds of inexplicable enlightenment appeared in his heart. His worldview of laws, which had already materialized as his life origin, squirmed during this process, as if it had sensed all kinds of mysteries that it had never felt before, and it faintly grew bit by bit as expected. This place will be the heaven realm of this world in the future. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind as he looked at the similarities and differences between the world above and below. A faint smile appeared on his face. The change in the nomological laws of the world was a change that occurred from the very foundation. Due to this change, everything changed from the root. The environment of the world changed into a state of ethereal celestial chi, and the living beings became completely different from before. However, they now carried all sorts of celestial chi. The original land gradually turned into a sea of clouds during this process. It looked like it was connected to the sea of clouds below. Moreover, the sea of clouds was not like the normal land, which only had one layer. Instead, it was divided into layers and layers. In the end, it was divided into countless layers. In each layer, there were countless living beings and all kinds of strange spiritual mountains and blessed lands that were born out of thin air. Chapter 1907. This building was extremely mysterious, and its status was extremely special. Not only did it have an extremely close connection with the world that was being replaced, but it also almost became the core of the entire world. It connected all the regions of the world, all the rules, all the space-time, and even the world under the sea of clouds. Of course, the connection to the world under the sea of clouds was not as close as it was to the world above the sea of cloud. This connection was more related to the rules of the Celestial Empire. In other words, it relied on the connection with the rules of the Celestial Empire to spread to this world and form a connection with this world. The moment this connection was established, Hun Ku, who was in the Celestial Empire, felt an inexplicable pull. It was as if an invisible force was wrapping around her and taking her to another world, to another place that was more suitable for her to live in. At this moment, Hun Ku understood that she was about to return to her position. The Celestial Emperor naturally had to stand high above and control the world. How could he be like an emperor in the mortal world, staying in the mortal world and personally controlling an empire? Fortunately, this guiding force was not too forceful, but it still gave her a choice and the possibility of postponing it. At this moment, Hun Ku immediately suppressed this pull. With a slight thought, countless orders were passed down to all the subordinates that she valued in the entire Celestial Empire. With these orders, the entire Celestial Empire suddenly erupted in a shocking excitement. Figures began to rapidly move from all over the world towards the capital of the Celestial Empire. That was to say, at this moment where Hun Ku was. In this Celestial Empire, with the support of the Celestial Empire's rules, even if these living beings were not strong, they could still receive a huge boost and rush to the capital at an unimaginable speed. Moreover, these living beings that Hun Ku valued, none of them were weak. Even the weakest among them was at the Sage-to-be realm. Needless to say, the speed of such existences was extremely fast. With the support of the Celestial Empire's rules, their speed was even faster. In just a few hours, they had already traversed an extremely long distance and directly appeared in the capital. They directly appeared not far from Hun Ku. There were tens of millions of living beings that Hun Ku had set his eyes on. They were so densely packed that they almost covered the entire sky of the capital. The powerful aura emitted by the creature seemed to be able to tear the sky apart. It shocked the many living beings in the capital in an extremely terrifying manner, letting them know that a drastic change was about to occur. Looking at the fanaticism in the eyes of his subordinates, Hun Ku gave a dignified smile and said, "Dear ministers, I am going to return to my position now. I wish to bring all of you up to the heaven realm, to control the mountains and rivers, to control the heavens and earth. I wonder if any of you are unwilling?" Since these living beings were able to come here, they were naturally extremely willing. At this time, they shouted in unison that they were willing to follow the Celestial Emperor through fire and water. Seeing this, Hun Ku smiled. Immediately, she instructed a subordinate who was already prepared to pass on the position of the Emperor of the mortal world to him, making him the second ruler of this world. Of course, compared to herself, This second-generation ruler was still much weaker. He could only be like an emperor in the mortal world, controlling the boundless land in front of her for her. This was the celestial empire that she had just unified not long ago. Compared to his original position, such a throne was naturally much better, but in terms of the real blessing, it was countless times worse than what Hun Ku had obtained. The second-generation emperor paid his respects to Hun Ku excitedly and loudly swore that he would definitely follow the celestial emperor's guidance and not deviate from the celestial emperor's path. He would shepherd all living beings for the celestial emperor. Then, under the seemingly jealous and pitiful gazes of many living beings that wanted to go to the heaven realm, he ascended to the position of emperor and became the supreme ruler of the celestial empire. When he took his position, the entire world trembled slightly. A large portion of the rules in the entire celestial empire had been transferred to his hands, becoming his power and being completely controlled by him. Only the few rules that could decide the life and death of an emperor were still in Hun Ku's hands. To an empire that possessed countless powerful forces, the change of an emperor would naturally cause all sorts of indescribable shock. Similarly, the news would also spread to every corner of the world at the fastest speed possible, allowing all living beings in the world to clearly hear the news. At that moment, countless ambitious living beings began to have new thoughts. However, all of this was already the emperor's problem. To Hun Ku, she was already a true celestial emperor. She only needed to truly step into the heaven realm and truly control the world above the sea of clouds, as well as the underworld beneath the earth. Then, there would no longer be any power that could shake her position and eliminate what she had obtained. It was buff. Under such circumstances, even if the celestial empire below collapsed and turned into countless countries, it would not change this fact or her status. In other words, even if the celestial empire collapsed and turned into countless countries, the master of any one of those countries would have to acknowledge her as the supreme ruler. They would have to first obtain her consent before they could take her position. They would only be able to survive if she felt that they could. Under such circumstances, what meaning did all the changes in the world have to her? She naturally did not have the mood to care about all of this. At this moment, she relaxed the suppression on the guiding power and led the millions of living beings that she valued and gradually began to emit an incomparably sacred light. Amidst this light, the sea of clouds parted and countless ceremonial guards, palace maids, and celestial soldiers and generals appeared behind them and bowed respectfully. They were waiting for her to ascend to the heavens, respectfully sending the celestial emperor back to her position. At this moment, all the living beings in the world knelt on the ground at the same time. They knelt in the direction of Hun Ku and the others and shouted loudly. This voice ignored the barriers of space-time and ignored the distance. It was transmitted from every corner of the world to the ears of Hun Ku and the others, making this place incomparably sacred. It made them feel as if an endless amount of faith was piled up on them. It was as if every one of them had turned into a god. Amidst this atmosphere, the many figures and living beings above the sea of clouds also shouted loudly, respectfully welcoming the celestial emperor back to her position. Compared to the shouts of all the living beings in the celestial emperor, this kind of shout was even more sacred and dignified. It even caused the entire world to tremble slightly. An endless amount of strange phenomena appeared in the world at this moment. Heavenly flowers rained down, exotic fragrances assailed the nostrils, heavenly sounds were indistinct, and celestial mist drifted. It made all the living beings. They couldn't help but be mesmerized. Amidst the endless strange phenomena, a light appeared under the feet of Hun Ku and the others. It wrapped around them and began to slowly rise. Gradually, they entered the sea of clouds and disappeared from everyone's eyes. And above the sea of clouds, after they disappeared, it began to retract, and in the blink of an eye, it had turned back into the sea of clouds. After that, even the sea of clouds started to tremble slightly before gradually disappearing into nothingness. When they looked up, they could no longer see the sea of clouds above. They could only see the vast blue sky and the endless starry sky behind it. The sun that had disappeared for a long time reappeared in the sky. However, this time, the sun was no longer the multiple suns from before. Instead, it had combined into a single sun. When the sun appeared, a bright moon also gradually appeared in the sky. It was as if an endless amount of light dots had started to gather, and in the end it turned into a bright moon. As for the bright moon, it was no longer as illusory and untouchable as before. Instead, it had turned into a physical, gigantic star in the depths of the starry sky. It stood opposite the sun from afar, illuminating this part of the world. The celestial emperor has returned. At that moment, countless living beings had this thought in their hearts. The world has become more complete. At that moment, an indescribable joy and satisfaction rose in their hearts. They felt comfortable and satisfied, as if their bodies had been washed by warm water. To all living beings in the world had become more complete, which brought them endless benefit. When they sensed this completeness, they naturally felt an inexplicable sense of satisfaction and joy from their instincts. This sort of joy and satisfaction suppressed the ambitions that were faintly born in the hearts of all living beings, causing the world to fall into a rare state of peace. While everyone in the world was sighing with emotion, Hun-Ku and the tens of millions of living beings that she valued had already entered the highest building complex in the world above the sea of clouds. This majestic building complex was extremely vast, and the number of buildings was not fixed. It could be changed at any time. Therefore, let alone tens of millions of people, even if there were hundreds of trillions of people, it would still be a piece of cake. Even then, this place did not seem crowded. I seem to have heard some legends about the heavenly court, but when did I hear them? Hun-Ku mumbled in front of the building complex. As she mumbled, the large building complex began to change. The largest and most majestic palace became the Lingshao Hall, and a huge and majestic gate appeared in the south of the building complex. It was the southern heavenly gate. The northern heavenly gate appeared in the north, then the eastern heavenly gate, the western heavenly gate, and the eastern heavenly gate. There were even palaces like the Tushita Palace appearing one after another. Everything seemed to be similar to the legends that Luo Fan had heard before he crossed over. It was somewhat inexplicably familiar, but there was an essential difference in the details. It was very strange. Looks like she's no longer who she used to be. She also remembers what you told her very clearly. At this moment, Luo Fan smiled and said to the person beside him. At this moment, the Space Maiden from an alternate timeline gradually appeared beside him. She had an extremely complicated expression on her face as she said, "It's because she remembers it so clearly that I'm sure that she's no longer who she used to be." This was the legend of the Heavenly Court. Clearly, only the Space Maiden from an alternate timeline and Luo Fan, who came from the Earth's universe, would know about it. However, Luo Fan had never told Hun-Ku about this. In that case, it was obvious that the one who told Hun-Ku was the Space Maiden from an alternate timeline, precisely because she knew about this. Luo Fan immediately understood how she knew about it after seeing the structure of the Heavenly Court. As for the Space Maiden from an alternate timeline saying this now, the reason was even simpler. Hun-Ku's behavior now. It was clear that he had gradually absorbed the memories of his previous life as a resource for his growth. In that case, the Space Maiden from an alternate timeline originally held on to the possibility that she could return to the past. Hun-Ku after she recovered her memories was completely destroyed. Shouldn't you already know? Luo Fan smiled faintly and said. The Space Maiden from an alternate timeline didn't speak again. After the transformation of this building complex was completed, Hun-Ku brought many living beings to the Lingshao Palace and sat on the throne. After that, all living beings began to worship her, and her position as the Celestial Emperor was officially established. The moment all living beings worshipped her, the entire heavenly realm began to tremble slightly. All the rules and principles seemed to have found their core and source, and suddenly became extremely stable. Extremely stable. The countless rules that Hun Ku had established over the years, which were still traceable, began to gradually disappear during this process. They melted into the real rules and principles, and eventually became untraceable, as if they had never existed. At the same time, Hun Ku directly felt that her cultivation realm had reached the final juncture. His own cultivation had already reached the final juncture, and it seemed like he only lacked a final opportunity to complete the final breakthrough and step into a new level. Under such circumstances, her body and mind had unknowingly entered an indescribable state. Following this state, she slowly opened her mouth and announced the rewards for all living beings in an extremely dignified manner, as if the heavens and earth were speaking in a voice. The North Pole Emperor, the North Star Emperor, the Celestial Emperor, and so on and so forth. All the positions necessary for the complete operation of the heavenly court were confirmed in her rewards. With each confirmed candidate, Hun Ku felt that she was a little closer to a true breakthrough. Just like that, even the King of Hell, the Judge of the Underworld, the Lord of Earth, and the minor positions of the Mountain God were confirmed. The tens of millions of people she had brought up finally had their own positions and responsibilities. After that, Hun Ku's body suddenly emitted endless light. This light pierced through the heavenly court, through the layers of clouds, through the world below, through the entire land, through the entire underworld, and directly enveloped the entire world within it. Along with this light, her cultivation realm began to rise. Her presence began to strengthen at a crazy rate. At this moment, an indescribable rumble began to reverberate throughout the world. When Luo Fan heard this roar, he knew that it was the will of the heavens and earth expressing something. However, it was clear that he was not in a state where he could elevate his willpower. Hence, he could not understand what this voice was trying to express. He could only vaguely feel that this voice seemed to contain a seemingly right, yet not quite right feeling of joy. This process went on for an unknown period of time. It felt as if time no longer had any meaning during this process. When everything calmed down, the world had already undergone a fundamental change. The cycle of reincarnation of the world that hadn't been established before was now truly established. The various natural changes that were originally uncontrollable, such as the clouds and rain, earthquakes and plagues, the reversal of the world, and so on, were all under the control of the heavenly court and the gods that Hun Ku had conferred. From then on, the entire world could be said to have fallen into an extremely strict and orderly state. For all living beings in this world, it could be said that they had lost a large portion of their freedom. However, to the world itself, it had already stabilized by an unknown number of times. As the creator of all of this, Hun Ku no longer had any special aura around her. She looked like an ordinary person. Even the Emperor's aura on her body had disappeared without a trace. Then, she narrowed her eyes and saw Luo Fan and the empty maiden from a different timeline that she had never been able to see before. "Father, Mother, I can finally see you for real," she murmured with boundless emotions in her eyes. At this moment there were countless living beings in the heavenly court, but they all had their own missions and responsibilities. Apart from the living beings that served or protected Hun Ku, no one else appeared before her. Hun Ku slowly stood up, as if she had never existed. She slowly disappeared in front of the creatures who were guarding her, causing them to gasp in astonishment and amazement. However, since they could become close to Hun Ku, they naturally weren't simple people. However, they could tell that this was Hun Ku's initiative, so they didn't panic. They were just cautious. At this moment, Hun Ku had already arrived in front of Luo Fan and the empty maiden from a different timeline. She knelt before them, and her eyes immediately turned red. Chapter 1908. These words calmed Hun Ku's expression instead. She said, "No, all these years, it's Dad and Mom who have really worked hard. If it wasn't for you two protecting me from behind, I might not even be able to become a celestial emperor in hundreds of thousands of years, let alone a few hundred years." Hearing this, the alternate timeline's air lady sighed and said, "In the end, it's the result of your hard work. We're just clearing the obstacles. Please search for the latest updates." Hun-Ku only shook her head firmly at this moment. The alternate timeline's air lady had an inexplicable nostalgia in her expression, as if she was reminded of her old friend Hun-Jing because of Hun-Ku's performance. "You've just obtained your current cultivation realm, but you need to properly consolidate it. In the next 100,000 years, you should properly consolidate it," Luo Fan said to Hun-Ku with a smile. Hun-Ku came to a realization and said, "Yes, I'll definitely properly consolidate it. After 100,000 years, I'll definitely be able to help you too." The alternate timeline's air lady nodded and said, "Go, you're already a celestial emperor now. Consolidating in the celestial court is the most efficient. If you're somewhere else, you'll probably get half the result with twice the effort." "Dad and Mom, you're coming too, right?" Hun-Ku looked at Luo Fan and the alternate timeline's air lady with great anticipation. Luo Fan only smiled and said, "You've gained a lot over these years, and I've also gained something. You need to consolidate it, and I need to consolidate it too, but it's not appropriate for me to go to the celestial court." The alternate timeline's air lady also smiled and said, "Although I didn't gain much, I've also gained something. It's not appropriate for me to go to the celestial court either." Hearing this, Hun-Ku couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. However, she was already a celestial emperor after all, and she wasn't the type who couldn't see the big picture. Even if she was disappointed, she wouldn't force Luo Fan and the alternate timeline's air lady because of this. She immediately bid farewell to them with great reluctance. After Hun-Ku left, Luo Fan asked the alternate timeline's air lady, "The place where that power is hasn't changed because of the upheaval in this world, right?" "Of course not. Where do you think that power is located? How is it possible for such a small change to cause such a change?" said the Space Maiden in the alternate timeline. Hearing this, Luo Fan nodded and said, "That's good. Then let's go there after 100,000 years." The air stewardess from a different timeline nodded. With a sway of his figure, he slowly disappeared. The direction in which she disappeared was towards the underworld. Clearly, she was heading towards the underworld to cultivate in seclusion. It was natural for her to consolidate the progress she had made over the years. After all, her progress was due to the suppression of the underworld. The best place to cultivate and comprehend was naturally the underworld. After she left, Luo Fan raised his head and looked at the boundless starry sky above the heavenly realm. He took a step forward and in the blink of an eye, he had already stepped out of the heavenly realm and into the starry sky. This starry sky, there was no end to it. There were countless stars in it, and they were filled with the essence of the stars. Before Hun-Ku returned to his position, these stars only operated according to the laws of heaven and earth. The endless essence of the stars spread out in all directions without any reservation. Any living being, as long as they stepped into it, they would be able to obtain all the essence of the stars they could come into contact with to cultivate and refine technique. However, now that Hun-Ku had returned to her position, the many Star Lords had also returned to their positions. However, there was already someone in control of them. Although this kind of controller couldn't completely control the fundamental operation of the countless stars, it was enough to control the essence energy emitted by the stars. They felt that the direction of the essence energy emitted by the stars would determine what kind of living being could use the essence energy to cultivate, to refine techniques. Under such circumstances, the feeling this place gave people was completely different. There seemed to be more order and more shackles. Entering this starry sky was no longer like before, where one entered an extremely free place. Instead, it was like entering a place with stricter shackles than the normal world. If Luo Fan was just an ordinary living being, the moment he stepped into this place, he would be discovered by the many Star Lords who controlled the endless stars. If the many star venerates controlling the boundless stars discovered him, countless gazes would instantly land on him. However, it was clear that he was not an ordinary living being. To him, even if Hanku was a celestial dharch, she would need to raise her strength to a level that could barely match his in order to discover his existence. None of the Star Lords could compare to Hanku, so it was naturally impossible for them to discover his existence. Therefore, at this time, the order in this starry sky was only that the essence of the stars was no longer as scattered as before. Nothing else had changed, there are still 3 million years. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind as he arrived on the bright moon, as if he was taking a stroll. It was because after suppressing the moon, or rather, the evolution of the heaven realm, his view of the world had improved greatly. In the end, it had led to the improvement of his cultivation realm. As a result, the third great calamity that he was about to encounter had been brought forward once again. Now, there were only a short 1,300,000 years left before the great calamity of the world would descend. It was precisely because of this that he had only given Hanku 100,000 years to consolidate her realm and grasp the various powers that she had obtained after reaching this realm. In fact, if not for the time limit of the descent of the Great Tribulation, he would have given Hanku 1,000,000 years. After all, to Hanku, the gap between her current self and before she became a celestial dharch was simply too great. 1,000,000 years to grasp the changes and allow her to completely control the power that she had gained after reaching this realm was actually quite fast. Compared to before, this bright moon had undergone an inexplicable change. In the past, this bright moon was only condensed from the essence of the lunar moon. Its foundation was actually still the current heaven realm, which was also the previous world. Even though it appeared to be a normal bright moon, there were still some differences in its foundation. However, the situation was different now. Currently, this bright moon had turned into a real star and became one of the two most dazzling stars in the entire starry sky. Vaguely, it had also become one of the true cores of the entire boundless starry sky. There was also a star venerate on this bright moon. However, this Star Lord was different from the other Star Lords. She was different from the other star venerates. She was a woman and became the extreme een of all the star venerates. She stood opposite the star venerates above the sun. They formed a relationship of mutual attraction and rejection. Among the many Star Lords in the starry sky, she was the leader of the female Star Lords. And this Star Lord was in a palace above the bright moon. That palace was called the Vast Cold Palace. Clearly, this was also a setting that Hanku had set up based on her memories of the legend of the Heavenly Court that the Space Maiden had told her back in the alternate timeline. The Moon Palace was on the back of the bright moon. The group of palaces was naturally very different from the legendary Moon Palace. Not only was it extremely lively, but it was also the place with the most people in the entire starry sky. Here, the bright moon Star Lord was sorting out yin and yang, harmonizing the circulation of the sun, moon, and stars. He appeared extremely busy. At this moment, Luo Fan landed on the bright moon. Although he did not conceal himself, just the difference in the sense of existence made it impossible for the Star Lord, who was the master of the bright moon, to discover his existence. Luo Fan did not linger on the surface of the bright moon. He lifted his foot and stepped forward, as if he did not exist. He slowly moved towards the depths of the bright moon. Before long, he arrived at the deepest part of the bright moon, where the star core was. The star core of the bright moon was a ball of spiritual light. It was a ball that was evolving. It was similar to the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. This kind of spiritual light came from the boundless starry sky in this world. It was the foundation of the bright moon's existence. As long as this ball of spiritual light existed, no matter how many times the bright moon was destroyed, no matter how much it was destroyed, it would gradually recover as time passed. In the end, it would return to its current state. The evolution of this ball of spiritual light would continue for a long time. After countless years, it would naturally evolve into a unique connate inextinguishable spiritual light that belonged to this world. This connate inextinguishable spiritual light was different from the true connate inextinguishable spiritual light that was born from chaos. Its nature was more like the man-made connate inextinguishable spiritual light that Luo Fan had created. This connate inextinguishable spiritual light was like the true connate inextinguishable spiritual light in this starry sky. It was eternal and indestructible. However, once it left this starry sky, this eternal and indestructible quality would be lost. Once it left this world, it would naturally turn into an ordinary spiritual light. In fact, apart from this bright moon, there were 129,600 stars in this starry sky that contained this kind of spiritual light. Among them, the spiritual light hidden in the depths of the sun was even greater than the spiritual light in this bright moon. After countless years, when this world developed to a certain extent, these 129,600 spiritual lights would collectively turn into a special connate inextinguishable spiritual light that would become the support of this starry sky and a pillar of this world. At that time, there would definitely be a great change. In other words, there would be a different level of a great tribulation that would be born to test this starry sky. Once he passed the test, this light would naturally turn into magic treasures that could only be used perfectly in the starry skies. Primordial origin spirit treasures. As Luo Fan looked at this spiritual light, countless information about this spiritual light flashed in his mind. After a while, an inexplicable bitter smile appeared on his face. This entire process seemed to be extremely smooth, as if there were no obstacles. As long as there was the accumulation of time, it would naturally develop to the end and turn this spiritual light into an existence similar to the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. However, the time needed was so long that it made him feel despair. According to his rough calculations, it would take at least hundreds of millions of years for this spiritual light to turn into an existence similar to the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. Moreover, the final Great Tribulation would be more terrifying than any previous Great Tribulation of the world. This world has become a new world. As a result, the essence of the stars in the starry sky also became slightly chaotic. At this moment, the many star lords in the starry sky all frowned. Their eyes pierced through the starry sky and looked towards the bright moon. The entire starry sky was already an incomparably tight and complete system. A slight change in one part could affect the entire system. The abnormality here could not be limited to the bright moon. Even the many stars were affected. The trembling did not last for long. Not long after, it calmed down. The bright moon lord sensed carefully. She had even reached the depths of the bright moon. She could even sense the core, the star core. Due to the limitations of her level of life and cultivation, even though she was the manager of the bright moon, she could not see through the fog and see the true face of the bright moon's core. To her, the core of the bright moon was just a star core that looked like a strange ball of magma. She had checked it countless times, but in the end, she did not find any abnormalities. She could not find the source of all the abnormalities. Perhaps it's because I haven't completely controlled the moon, which is why there are such abnormalities. After thinking for a long time, she could not find the source. She could only comfort herself in this way. She was very clear that regardless of whether this was true or not, the fact that she could not sense it at all was enough to show that this was not something she could participate in. Of course, before she completely let go of this matter, she still sent a report to the Celestial Dharch in the end, informing him of this anomaly. Luo Fan did not care about the changes caused by his awakening at all. At this time, his eyes shined brilliantly. He lifted his hand and grasped at the void. In an instant, his hand reached into the gap between the world and the state of chaos. In an instant, he grabbed the primordial origin spirit treasure embryo that he had thrown into the gap. Compared to the first time he stepped into the gap between the world and the world, it was extremely easy for him to reach his hand into it this time. It was as if he was reaching into his pocket and taking something out. He did not use much strength at all. He raised his hand and drew back the spirit treasure embryo. It appeared directly in the bright moon's core. Compared to before, although the spirit treasure embryo had absorbed the chaotic aura for a long time, it had only grown a little stronger overall. On the whole, the difference was not that great. Looking at the spirit treasure embryo's appearance, Luo Fan sighed to himself. He once again deeply felt the difficulty of evolving this spirit treasure embryo into a true chaotic origin spiritual treasure. He immediately loosened his grip on the spirit treasure embryo, and it suddenly floated into the air. The light and shadow within it began to slowly circulate. Faintly, there seemed to be stars slowly appearing within it. In a trance, boundless information seemed to be pouring into the numinous treasure embryo, and at the same time, boundless information seemed to be emanating from the numinous treasure embryo. The entire process seemed to be extremely profound and marvelous, and it was impossible to describe with words. Following this change, the spirit treasure embryo began to gradually increase at a speed that was even faster than the chaotic aura it had absorbed in the gap. Chapter 1909. At the same time, the entire starry sky began to squirm slightly. Indistinctly, it began to slowly expand. However, compared to the various movements in the starry sky before, the current squirming and expansion was no longer detected by any living beings. At the very least, it was no longer detected by the many star lords in the starry sky. To the many star lords, all the movements in the starry sky had already ended. Everything was peaceful and the world was at peace. Sure enough, the starlight is greatly beneficial to the evolution of the spiritual treasure embryo. Such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. As he thought about this, he gradually forgot everything in the outside world. Even the flow of time had escaped his senses. The spiritual treasure embryo was already closely connected to him. If the spiritual treasure embryo grew and strengthened, it would mean that he himself would grow and strengthen. Especially when he had a telepathic connection, he naturally felt even more empathizing with them. Time gradually passed while he was in this state. Unknowingly, 10,000 years had passed. On a certain day 10,000 years later, Luo Fan's heart stirred. He suddenly woke up from that inexplicable state, and a faint smile appeared on his face. At this moment, the spirit treasure embryo before him was still slightly wriggling, constantly communicating with the starlight before him. Similarly, the entire starry sky was also constantly wriggling, communicating with the starlight before him. If this continued, it was obvious that the spiritual treasure embryo would still be able to obtain a lot of benefits from this and grow significantly. However, at this time, Luo Fan did not want to wait any longer. After all, although this kind of growth could bring many benefits to the spiritual treasure embryo, he had already made an agreement with Space Maiden and the others in an alternate timeline. At this moment, it was time for him to explore the power that could lead the countless fragments of the shattered world to gradually reform. Not to mention the fact that that power was extremely meaningful to him and could bring him a lot of benefits. Just the agreement alone was enough for him to stop the evolution of the spiritual treasure embryo at this moment. With a slight thought, the spiritual treasure embryo had already been absorbed into his body. As the spiritual treasure embryo left its position, the starlight stopped squirming. Because of this, the entire starry sky stopped squirming and expanding. An indescribable sense of irritation spread through the entire starry sky. This affected the many star venerates in the starry heavens. One by one, their expressions began to change, revealing a kind of indescribable surprise and annoyance. However, they weren't ordinary living beings in the end. They were powerful cultivators that had a superb grasp of the mind. Even though this sort of annoyance and surprise came from the bottom of their hearts, they were still able to control it with reason. It didn't take long for them to suppress this sort of surprise and annoyance. Luo Fan did not care about all of this. At this moment, he had an idea. With a single step, he had already left the bright moon, left the starry sky, and arrived in the heavenly realm, before the southern heavenly gate of the heavenly court. At this moment, Air Maiden and Hun Ku, who were in a different timeline, were waiting for him here. With just a glance, Luo Fan knew that the two of them hadn't wasted their time in the past 100,000 years. At this moment, they were much stronger than they had been in the past. They had completely stabilized their cultivation, which they couldn't stabilize in the past. In the face of such a change, Luo Fan's expression was quite calm. He smiled faintly and said, "It seems like you're ready. Of course, we're just waiting for you." The Air Maiden did not show him any respect and frowned. Luo Fan smiled and said, "I came at the right time. You're just early." "Alright, Daddy, Mommy, stop arguing. Where are we going? Hurry up and go." "I can't wait," Hun Ku said with a smile. Upon hearing this, Luo Fan only smiled and looked at the Air Maiden in a different timeline. Only the Air Maiden in a different timeline knew where that power was. Of course, she was the only one who could answer this question. Being stared at by Luo Fan like this, the Air Maiden in a different timeline regained her composure and said, "Let's go. Just follow me." As she spoke, her figure swayed and gradually turned into nothingness. She dived into the depths of the rules. Seeing this, Luo Fan's eyes flashed and he asked Hun Ku, "Can you follow me?" "No problem," Hun Ku said confidently. As she spoke, her figure gradually turned into nothingness and dived into the depths of the rules. She followed closely behind the Air Maiden in a different timeline. This method of diving into the depths of the rules was not something that ordinary cultivators possessed. At the very least, one had to be a false sage to be able to do it. However, even a false sage could only dive a little and could not really go too deep. If one wanted to easily penetrate the entire layer of rules, one had to be at least a supreme emperor to be able to do it. At the very least, that was the case in this world. It was because of this requirement that Luo Fan asked Hun Ku if she could follow him. Clearly, he had somewhat underestimated Hun Ku. At that moment, he only shook his head and dived into the depths of the rules. It wasn't the first time for Luo Fan to dive into the depths of the laws. Therefore, at this time, he was very familiar with the process. He seemed inexplicably relaxed and didn't show the slightest bit of difficulty. Just like that, the three of them continued to advance towards the depths of the nomological laws. Around them were endless threads and endless streams of light that flickered incessantly as they left them behind. Among the three of them, the one who was the most relaxed was Luo Fan. At this moment, he seemed to be taking a stroll in a normal space-time. His expression was calm, relaxed, and unhurried as he took one step at a time. The next to him was the Air Maiden in a different timeline. Although she was not as relaxed as Luo Fan, she was still calm and did not seem to be struggling at all. In contrast, Hun Ku's performance was much worse. Although she could barely keep up with their hostess and Luo Fan in the alternate timeline, her face was filled with difficulty. Every step seemed to require a great deal of energy. Every step required her to search for her own potential before she could take it. Looking at her performance, Luo Fan was not too disappointed. Compared to Hun Ku, his performance when he first dived into the depths of the laws of heaven and earth was much better. It was only a little better in the beginning. The process of Space Maiden diving into the depths of the rule of law was exactly the same as what Luo Fan had done. But as time went by, as they gradually dived to a certain depth, the method of Space Maiden's infiltration began to gradually change. It was a change that Luo Fan had never experienced before. He had never understood or even thought that such a method existed. As the infiltration method changed, Luo Fan gradually felt a little strenuous. It seems that there are still mysteries hidden in the rule of law that I don't understand. Such a thought gradually emerged in Luo Fan's mind. Compared to Luo Fan, who felt a little strenuous, the performance of Space Maiden in a different timeline was not much worse than his. At this moment, she only appeared to be a little strenuous. After all, the process of diving into the depths of the laws wasn't too different in terms of difficulty. The reason why Luo Fan's performance at the beginning and the end was so different was because he was familiar with the process at the beginning. He had infiltrated like this several times. He was very clear about the places where he could take advantage of the obstacles, so he appeared to be extremely relaxed. The obstructions he was facing now were normal obstructions. That was why there was such a gap. However, it was different for Space Maiden in a different timeline. For her, the entire infiltration process was between familiarity and strangeness. There was no essential difference between familiarity and strangeness. Under such circumstances, her infiltration naturally followed the evolution of the rule of law. Naturally, it was just a gradual change. That was why there was a difference between before and after. Naturally, it would not be too big. It was only because of this that such a difference would appear. At this moment, the two of them were only a little strenuous. In contrast, Hunku, who was in the middle, seemed to be struggling. Almost every step she took seemed to consume an endless amount of her strength. It was almost as if she was overdrafting her own potential. The aura on her body was turbulent and her strength was constantly surging. Faintly, there was an unknown number of loud sounds coming from her body. Even the heavenly realm outside had a slight change at this moment. It seemed that the flow of power had become faster. Faced with her strenuous effort, Luo Fan sighed. He slowly raised his hand and leaned on Hunku's back. In the blink of an eye, an indescribable power enveloped her body and diverted a large portion of the resistance she had encountered from the laws of the world to his body. With the transfer of this resistance, Luo Fan felt his body become heavier. The resistance he encountered as he dived deeper became even greater, making him feel even more strenuous. However, in contrast, Hunku felt her body become lighter. Although it was still strenuous, it was no longer like before, where she felt that she needed to overdraft herself to continue moving forward. An inexplicable sadness appeared in Hunku's heart. In the end, I'm still a burden to my parents. Under this inexplicable emotion, her expression naturally changed slightly. Seeing this, Luo Fan instantly knew what she was thinking. He smiled and said, "This path is very difficult, but you can definitely pass it. It's just that if you do this, you'll consume too much energy. When you reach the destination, you won't know what to do and how much energy you'll consume. That's why I'm helping you." Hearing this, even though Hunku knew that Luo Fan was just comforting her, she still felt much better. The empty lady in the alternate timeline led the way in front, ignoring Luo Fan and Hunku who were behind her. It seemed that leading the way had already consumed all of her energy. The surrounding threads were constantly changing, and the flowing light was also constantly changing, causing the surrounding scenery to unknowingly turn into a completely unfamiliar and mysterious state. It was already fundamentally different from when he first dived into the depths of the laws and principles. Of course, similarly, the entire process of diving into the gap between the heaven and earth and the state of chaos was also fundamentally different from when Luo Fan first dived into the state of chaos. After an unknown period of time, which felt like hundreds of years, but also like tens of thousands of years, the empty lady in the alternate timeline finally stopped and shouted, "It's here!" At this moment, Luo Fan and the rest noticed their surroundings. After such a long time, the surrounding light and shadows had already turned into a blur. They could no longer see anything around them clearly. They could no longer recognize the rule of law that might exist, nor could they recognize the strange flowing light. In front of them, in the direction that the empty lady in the alternate timeline was looking at, there was nothing there. However, there was nothing there. There was nothing there, and it looked no different from the misty surroundings. "What's this? I don't see anything." Luo Fan frowned. Vaguely, he knew what kind of existence was in front of him. If he guessed correctly, it was there. It was similar to the gap between the heaven and earth and the state of chaos. Of course, it was not a state between the heaven and earth and the state of chaos. Instead, its existence was similar to that gap. The gap between the heaven and earth and the state of chaos existed for Luo Fan, who had such a concept in his heart. However, for other living beings and cultivators who didn't have such a concept, it didn't exist at all. In other words, it was the thing in front of the empty lady in the alternate timeline. Perhaps it existed in the cognition of the empty lady in the alternate timeline, but in his cognition, it was a place that did not exist at all. The empty lady in the alternate timeline seemed to have come to a sudden realization at this moment. She said, "As expected, you can't sense its existence. No wonder you need me to lead the way." All along, Luo Fan was extremely powerful and almost omnipotent in the eyes of the empty lady in the alternate timeline. Therefore, she had no confidence that her sensing ability was stronger than Luo Fan's. If Luo Fan knew the existence of a certain thing and wanted to find it, the possibility of finding it was definitely many times higher than for her to find it. However, this time, Luo Fan needed to rely on her to find the source of the power. This had always been a doubt in her heart. Until now. Only now did she finally understand the reason behind it. "It seems that this is indeed my own opportunity," the empty lady in the alternate timeline said with an inexplicable smile on her face. The empty lady in the alternate timeline had been cultivating for billions of years. To say that she was experienced and knowledgeable would be an understatement. This kind of thing could be seen by one person, but not by others. She had experienced or heard of situations where she couldn't feel anything at all. She had experienced it many times. At this moment, although she was a little surprised that Luo Fan could not sense the existence of the place in front of her, she soon found an explanation. "Opportunity?" Luo Fan just smiled and said, "Then share the opportunity with me. Anyway, wasn't that your original plan?" Hearing this, the empty lady in the alternate timeline's expression changed. There was an inexplicable sense of defeat in her eyes. That was the truth. Originally, Luo Fan did not know the existence of that power. It was precisely because she thought that she could not benefit from that power on her own that she had no choice but to cooperate with Luo Fan to come here. This action was actually sharing the opportunity that originally belonged to her with Luo Fan. Then, she said, "All right, I'll share the opportunity with you." As she spoke, she pointed and an inexplicable spiritual light rushed out of her hand. In the blink of an eye, it had already arrived in front of Luo Fan. Luo Fan swept his gaze across the spiritual light, and in an instant, he completely understood all the information contained in the spiritual light. A look of realization appeared on his face, and the scene in his eyes began to gradually change. This kind of opportunity sharing in the hands of the empty lady in the alternate timeline sounded mysterious, but the principle was actually relatively simple. It was just to establish a certain concept that did not exist in the beginning for others. Then, the thing that originally existed but did not exist in one's cognition would reappear in one's eyes. It was just like how if Luo Fan wanted someone to see the gap between heaven and earth and the state of chaos, he only needed to use a specific method to inform others of the existence of the gap and help others establish the concept that the gap really existed. And that was exactly what the empty lady in the alternate timeline did. Of course, this was not a method that the empty lady in the alternate timeline thought of after she understood that Luo Fan could not see the source of the situation in front of her. Instead, it was a method that was finally sorted out after countless attempts and the accumulation of countless predecessors over the endless years. In fact, to the empty lady in the alternate timeline, she could use such a method to let Luo Fan see the situation in front of her, but she did not know why he could see it by doing so. To her, this was the mystery of opportunity, and her method was only the correct way to share the opportunity. As for the concept that Luo Fan established from the empty lady in the alternate timeline, it was that in the depths of the rules, between the rules and the great Tao, there was a source of rules. This source of rules was based on the great Tao and extended endless rules and laws, stabilizing time, space, matter, energy, and constructing all things in the world. To use a tree as an analogy, the endless rules and laws were like the countless branches of a tree, and the great Tao was the tree's root. In Luo Fan's eyes, the branches of this tree were directly the tree's roots. However, in the Empyrean's concept of a different timeline, between the branches and the tree roots, there was a node similar to a bamboo node, to be continued. Chapter 1910. It turns out that between the great Tao and the laws of rules, there is still the origin of the laws. Luo Fan looked at the strange place that had just appeared in front of him, and such a thought flashed in his mind. Phoenix, Phoenix, quick update please search. In his eyes, an extremely dazzling ball of light filled his entire field of vision. This ball of light was emitting wisps of brilliance. They were like wisps of silk threads, spreading and dancing in the void. When the light spread out to a certain distance, it began to gradually condense and converge. In the end, it turned into endless laws and laws that gradually scattered between the heavens and the earth, becoming the fundamental order of everything in the world, where the fundamental rules and laws resided. At this moment, the Sky Maiden from a different timeline was standing in front of the ball of light. She raised her hand and touched the light. Her eyes were filled with intoxication, as if she was being washed by endless warm water. "Daddy, Mommy, what do you see? Why can't I see anything?" Hun Ku asked. Upon hearing this, Luo Fan just smiled and waved his hand. The spiritual light in front of him was transferred to her. Hun Ku had long been curious about what Luo Fan and the Sky Maiden from a different timeline had seen. Now that she had the opportunity to see this too, how could she let it go? She raised her hand without hesitation and grabbed the spiritual light in her hand. Then, with a thought, the boundless information contained in the spiritual light poured into her heart, and she instantly understood it. As she understood this information, her eyes were filled with shock. The world in front of her also began to gradually change, and she vaguely saw the vast and boundless world that Luo Fan and the others had seen. She also saw that the ball of light was extremely dazzling and pure. The extremely condensed light. This is the origin of the law. What a vast existence! She murmured, her eyes filled with indescribable shock. Compared to Luo Fan, who could understand this change on a deeper level, Hun Ku couldn't do it at all. To her, all of this was really the opportunity that her parents had shared with her. At this moment, her heart was filled with indescribable emotions. Previously, Luo Fan had worked hard in the process of her unifying the world. All kinds of help involuntarily emerged in her heart at this moment, making her feel even more touched. "I think it shouldn't be that easy to enter that place, right?" Luo Fan turned to the Sky Maiden from a different timeline. "I thought of a way that requires the three of us to work together to do it. However, it consumes a lot of energy. After using it, I'm afraid we'll need to spend many years to fully recover. I wonder if you have any other way?" Space Maiden from the alternate timeline asked. Hearing this, Luo Fan instantly knew what she was thinking. He finally understood what method she had originally planned to use. Just like back then when the two world wills wanted to summon the starry sky from ancient times and fix it above this world, they needed a third fulcrum to bear the burden. According to the original plan of the Empty Lady in the alternate timeline, the three of them were obviously going to be the fulcrum to support the barrier of the origin of the natural order and allow them to step inside. However, if they did that, the contraction force produced by the origin of the natural order would be transferred to them. The origin of the natural order itself was an existence where the great Tao of heaven and earth intersected with the natural order. It was as absolute as the great Tao. Even though all three of them had surpassed the supreme martial emperors, they would definitely suffer great losses if they were to withstand such pressure, be it in terms of strength or other aspects. It would definitely consume an incomparably huge amount of energy. In that case, although Luo Fan could recover in a few days, with Han Ku's realm and her level, it would probably take more than 100 years to do so. That's not appropriate. Let me see if there is any other way. Luo Fan shook his head faintly. The empty lady in the alternate timeline had a knowing look on her face. She nodded and said, "Then it's up to you." She immediately stepped aside and went to Han Ku's side, pulling her hand and retreating again. Luo Fan could not help but feel helpless when he saw her acting as if she was facing a formidable enemy. After all, not all of his methods were so shocking. However, there was no need to say much. He immediately went up to the origin of the natural order and slowly pressed his hand on it. The light contained endless mysteries and mysteries. The mysteries of the great Tao and the profundities of the natural order were all contained within. Apart from that, there was also a mysterious place that was similar to spacetime and nothingness. It was more like the great Tao, but it also seemed to be in a chaotic state. It's here. At this moment, Luo Fan had already determined where he was looking for. That indescribable power was definitely in that incomparably mysterious and bizarre place. This place was hidden in the depths of the origin of the natural order. It was faintly discernible, and seemed to exist at the same time. If he had not known about the existence of that power long ago, even Luo Fan would not have been able to discover that place. At this moment, endless information flashed through Luo Fan's mind. The infinite mysteries of the origin of the natural order kept appearing in his mind. The structure, the fundamental interaction process of the natural order, and the way in which the mysteries of the great Tao existed, and so on and so forth. All of these kept appearing in his mind. Given Luo Fan's cultivation realm, which was about to trigger the third major calamity, it was extremely difficult for him to understand these mysteries. It could even be said that it was almost impossible to fully understand them. However, not being able to fully understand them did not mean that he could not find the gaps in these mysteries and find the root of all these changes. While he was calculating, the origin of the natural order in front of him seemed to have turned into an incomparably huge sun. As for him, he seemed to have turned into an ordinary person. In the depths of this sun, there was a strange space hidden. And inside that space, there was a treasure that was extremely attractive to him. He needed to split the sun in order to get it. Under such circumstances, it went without saying how difficult it would be to achieve all these and achieve this goal. While he was thinking, an inexplicable idea became clearer and clearer in his mind. If he wanted to enter the sun, he would naturally be able to turn into the sun similarly. If he wanted to step into the origin of the natural order, and turn into a state similar to the origin of the natural order, it would naturally be easy to do so. Moreover, in that case it would be like a drop of water falling into the sea. He would not encounter any resistance at all, and would not suffer any harm. With this thought in mind, Luo Fan wore a faint smile on his face. It was almost impossible for ordinary cultivators to transform themselves into the source of laws. However, for Luo Fan, who had completely integrated his world view of laws and turned his life source into the manifestation of his world view of laws, it might be difficult, but it would only take him a little more effort. After all, for living beings, worldviews were equivalent to their own grand Tao. Now, Luo Fan had connected his worldview with everything about himself. It was equivalent to completely connecting one's great Tao to everything within oneself. In this way, he could naturally transform himself into a form similar to the origin of the natural order through adjustments. Of course, this form was obviously different from the form of the origin of the natural order. However, as long as it was in the same form as the origin of the natural order, it would be easy to simulate and change it. With this train of thought, Luo Fan's face was full of confidence. It seems. You've already thought of a way. Air Maiden's eyes were full of horror at this moment. She had thought for many years before coming up with a way to open the origin of the natural order with 3 fulcrums and then enter it. However, this person in front of her had already found a way after just sensing it and thinking for a short period of time. Wasn't the gap too huge? Although I have an idea, it will take time to really reach the point where it can be implemented. Next, I'll think about it carefully. You guys take the opportunity to recover your cultivation, said Luo Fan. Hearing this, both Air Maiden and Hun-Ku nodded. Indeed, they needed to take a good rest to recuperate. After all, the process of pushing through the rule of order and stepping into the depths of the rule of order was consuming their energy at every moment. Needless to say, Space Maiden, who was in a different timeline, was exhausted. She was the first to open a path in an unfamiliar place, so it went without saying how much energy she would consume. Although Hun-Ku had Luo Fan's help to take over a part of the resistance, there was still a part of the resistance after all. Her own strength was the weakest, so her consumption would only be greater than that of the Space Maiden in the alternate timeline. It could be said that their current strength was at most 60% of the normal situation. Although this strength was still terrifying, it was obviously not at its peak. It could not adapt to the perfect requirements of Luo Fan and Air Maiden. Seeing that the two of them sat cross-legged and began to cultivate to recover their strength, Luo Fan nodded and began to create a secret art according to his previous idea, so that not only could he change his body structure, but also Hun-Ku and Air Maiden's body structure. With his own body as a reference, the difficulty of creating such a secret art was greatly reduced for Luo Fan. However, even so, several days had passed by the time he was finally able to complete the creation. It's finally done. On this day, Luo Fan's eyes lit up, and such a thought flashed through his mind. At this moment, there was an additional secret art in his mind. This part of the incantation was not complicated. There were only about 300 words, but each word contained an extremely profound truth. It could be said that each word was a gem, and each word was mysterious. When each word was extended, it could become thousands upon thousands of words. In other words, if these 300 words were to be expanded, the number of words would be in the millions. After carefully checking this secret art again, and confirming that there were no mistakes, he slowly began to activate the mysterious power in his body and began to circulate this secret art. As the secret art was circulated, his body began to gradually change. From his original appearance of flesh and blood, he gradually turned into a figure of light. This figure of light blended with the surrounding light as if it had become a part of the surrounding light. At first glance, it was almost indistinguishable. This instantly woke up Hun-Ku, who was recovering her cultivation, and Empty Maiden, who was in a different timeline. When they saw the change in Luo Fan's body, both of them were shocked. How is this possible? How can such a technique be created? Empty Maiden, who was in a different timeline, was no longer as calm as usual. She just muttered. She had long known about the existence of the origin of the natural order. She was very clear about the mysteries and profoundness contained in the origin of the natural order. She did not even hope that she would be able to fully comprehend this mystery one day. Under such circumstances, she suddenly saw someone not only fully comprehend this mystery, but also use this mystery to create a mysterious technique like an incarnation. One could imagine the frustration she felt. Luo Fan stopped the secret art at this moment. His body slowly transformed from the state of the figure of light to that of flesh and blood, returning to his normal state. In the end, it's still not perfect. After recovering, he sighed. Just now, he had indeed transformed into the same kind of existence as the origin of the natural order. However, during this process, he felt a faint pressure coming from the origin of the natural order. This kind of pressure pressed down on his body, pressed down on his mind, made him feel as if his body was being pressed down on countless worlds. This situation was obvious. Although the technique had been created, the transformed origin of the natural order was still different from the real origin of the natural order, so he could not fully integrate it. Although he knew this drawback, there was no way for him to improve it, because the root of this weakness was that his world view of the natural order was still not truly perfect. His world view of the natural order was still different from the world view of the true sage level. In other words, as long as his world view of the natural order couldn't be upgraded to the true sage level, then this weakness must exist. After sighing in his heart for a while, Luo Fan recovered. Although there were still weaknesses, this was already in line with his requirement. That kind of pressure would oppress him, but it would not really stop him from stepping into the origin of the natural order. Moreover, the consumption of moving forward would not be too much. At least, compared to the method of using 3 fulcrums to support the origin of the natural order, the consumption of this method was at least 10,000 times less. Even for Hun Ku, this kind of consumption would only take a few days to recover. All kinds of thoughts flashed in his mind. Luo Fan turned his head to look at Hun Ku and Air Maiden in a different timeline. At this time, the two of them had already stopped adjusting their breath. "Have you fully recovered?" Luo Fan asked. Both of them nodded at this time, but they did not speak. Air Maiden in a different timeline was frustrated and had no interest in speaking. Meanwhile, Hun Ku was waiting for her to speak. "Well then, this is the method I thought of. I think you can see what my method is, right?" Luo Fan smiled. As he spoke, 2 spiritual lights appeared in his hands and rushed towards Air Maiden and Hun Ku in a different timeline. In the blink of an eye, they had already arrived in front of them. The 2 specks of spiritual light contained the more than 300 words of the spell. However, Space Maiden and Hun Ku, who were in a different timeline, took half a day to finish reading the over 300 words. Every word was light to Luo Fan, without the slightest bit of weight. However, for the 2 of them, every word seemed to be a part of the world. It was so heavy that they had to go all out to receive it in order to be able to draw it into their hearts. Every time they received a word, they needed to rest for a while before they could recover and continue with the next one. In this way, it took them half a day to receive the more than 300 words. As soon as they received the more than 300 words, they sat down cross-legged in the air without hesitation. They closed their eyes and began to comprehend this method, carefully experiencing the endless mysteries within. Spots of spiritual light were slowly released from their bodies. They were pulsating slightly as if they were inhaling and exhaling. During the process of creating the method, Luo Fan had already consulted their strength and cultivation path. Their strength and might would naturally not be an obstacle in cultivating this method. Therefore, in just a few days, their bodies gradually began to emit a light that was extremely similar to the light around them. As the light emitted, the light around them seemed to have found a partner and began to entangle their bodies continuously. Gradually, an indescribable resonance was formed with the light on their bodies. This resonance was the key to the cultivation of this technique. As the resonance occurred, the light emitted from their bodies gradually changed and transformed as if it had found a template and began to gradually transform into the light around them. Chapter 1911. It turns out that between the Great Tao and the nomological laws, there's actually the origin of the laws. Luo Fan thought to himself as he looked at the strange place that had just appeared in front of him. In his eyes, an extremely dazzling light filled his entire field of vision. This ball of light was emitting wisps of brilliance, like strands of silk thread, constantly spreading and dancing in the void. When these lights spread out to a certain distance, they began to gradually condense and converge. In the end, they turned into endless nomological laws and nomological laws that gradually dispersed between heaven and earth, becoming the fundamental order and the fundamental rules of everything in heaven and earth. At this very moment, the Space Maiden in a different timeline was standing in front of the ball of light. She raised her hand and touched the ball of light. Her eyes shining with her eyes revealed an intoxicated expression, as if she was being washed by endless warm water. "Daddy, Mommy, what do you see? Why can't I see anything?" Hun Ku suddenly spoke. Upon hearing this, Luo Fan just smiled and waved his hand. The light in front of him was transferred to her. Hun Ku had long been curious about what Luo Fan and the Sky Maiden from a different timeline had seen. Now that she had the opportunity to see this too, how could she let it go? Without any hesitation, he raised his hand and caught the spiritual light in his hand. Then, her heart moved. The endless information contained in the light was poured into her heart. It poured into her heart, and she instantly understood it. As she understood the information, her eyes were filled with shock. The world in front of her also began to gradually change. Vaguely, she saw what Luo Fan and the others had seen. It was a vast and boundless world. She also saw that incomparably dazzling light. It was incomparably pure. An incomparably condensed light. This is the origin of the laws. What a vast existence! She murmured, her eyes filled with indescribable shock. Compared to Luo Fan, who could understand these changes on a deeper level, Hun Ku could not do it at all. To her, all of this was really an opportunity that her parents had shared with her. At this moment, her heart was filled with indescribable emotions. Previously, Luo Fan had worked hard for her in the process of unifying the world. All sorts of help involuntarily appeared in her heart at this moment, making her feel even more touched. I think I want to get inside. It shouldn't be that simple, right? Luo Fan turned to air hostess in the alternate timeline. I've thought of a way, but it requires the three of us to work together. However, it consumes a lot of energy. After using it, I'm afraid we'll need to spend many years to fully recover. I wonder if you have any other way? Space Maiden from the alternate timeline asked. Hearing this, Luo Fan instantly knew what she was thinking and understood what method she had originally planned to use. It was just like how the two wills of heaven and earth wanted to summon the starry sky from ancient times. It seemed that a third fulcrum was needed to support the re-establishment of this world. According to the original plan of the Empyrean in the alternate timeline, the three of them were obviously going to be the fulcrum to support the barrier of the origin of the natural order so that they could step into it. However, if they did that, the contraction force produced by the origin of the laws would be transferred to them. The origin of the laws itself was an existence where the laws of heaven and earth intersected. The contraction force of this existence was as absolute as the laws of heaven and earth. Even if all three of them had surpassed the supreme monarch realm, they would definitely suffer huge losses if they were to endure such pressure. At that time, both their strength and other aspects would definitely be greatly exhausted. In that case, although Luo Fan could recover in a few days, given Hun Ku's realm and her level, it would probably take her hundreds of years to do so. That's not appropriate. Let me see if there's any other way. Luo Fan shook his head faintly. The air lady in the alternate timeline had a knowing look on her face. She nodded and said, "It's up to you then." She immediately stepped aside and came to Hun Ku's side. She pulled her hand and retreated again. Luo Fan could not help but feel helpless when he saw her acting as if she was facing a formidable enemy. After all, not all of his methods were so shocking. However, there was no need to say much. He immediately went up to the origin of the laws and slowly pressed his hand on the origin of the laws. That ball of light contained endless mysteries and mysteries. The mysteries of the Great Path and the profundities of the nomological laws were all contained within it. Apart from that, there was also a mysterious place that was similar to space-time, nothingness, and more like the laws of heaven and earth. There was also a vague, chaotic state inside. It's here. At this moment, Luo Fan had already determined where he was looking for. That indescribable power was definitely in that incomparably mysterious and bizarre place. This place was hidden in the depths of the origin of the laws, and it was faintly discernible. If it wasn't for the fact that he knew about the existence of this power, even Luo Fan wouldn't have been able to discover it. At this moment, endless information flashed through Luo Fan's mind. The infinite mysteries of the origin of the laws kept appearing in his mind. The structure, the fundamental interaction between the laws of heaven and earth, and the way the mysteries of the laws of heaven and earth existed, and so on and so forth. All these thoughts kept appearing in his mind. Given Luo Fan's cultivation realm, which was about to trigger the third major calamity, it was extremely difficult for him to understand these mysteries. It could even be said that it was almost impossible to fully understand them. However, not being able to fully understand them didn't mean that he couldn't find the gaps in these mysteries and find the root of all these changes. While he was calculating, the origin of the laws in front of him seemed to have turned into an incomparably huge sun. As for him, it was as if he had turned into an ordinary person. In the depths of this sun, there was a strange space hidden. Within that space, there was a treasure that was extremely attractive to him. He had to split the sun apart in order to obtain it. Under such circumstances, it would be extremely difficult to achieve all of this and achieve this goal. It went without saying. While he was thinking, an inexplicable idea became clearer and clearer in his mind. If he wanted to enter the sun and turn himself into the sun, it would naturally be possible. Similarly, if he wanted to step into the origin of the laws and turn himself into a state similar to the origin of the laws, it would naturally be easy to do so. Moreover, in that case it would be like a drop of water falling into the sea. He wouldn't encounter any resistance at all and wouldn't suffer any harm. With such a thought emerging, Luo Fan put on a faint smile on his face. It was almost impossible for ordinary cultivators to turn themselves into the origin of the laws. However, for Luo Fan, who had completely integrated his own world view of the laws and turned his life origin into the manifestation of the world view of the laws, although it was difficult, it would only take a little more effort. After all, the world view itself was equivalent to the existence of one's own great Tao. Now that Luo Fan had integrated the worldview into himself, it was equivalent to completely integrating his own great Tao into himself in this way. Naturally, he could transform himself into a form similar to the origin of the laws through adjustments. Of course, this form was obviously different from the form of the origin of the laws in front of him. However, as long as it was the same form belonging to the origin of the laws, it would be easy to simulate and change it. With such a thought, Luo Fan's face was full of confidence. It seems that you've already thought of a way. Air Maiden's eyes were full of horror at this moment. She had thought about it for many years before coming up with a way to open the origin of the laws with 3 fulcrums and enter it. However, this person in front of her had already found a way after just sensing it and thinking for a short period of time. Wasn't the gap too huge? Although I have an idea, it will still take time to really reach the point where it can be implemented. Next, I will think about it carefully. You guys should take the opportunity to recover your cultivation, said Luo Fan. Hearing this, Air Maiden and Hun Ku nodded in agreement. Indeed, they needed to take a good rest to recuperate. After all, the process of pushing through the rule of laws and stepping into the depths of the rule of laws had been exhausting their energy at every moment. There was no need to mention Space Maiden, who was in a different timeline. She was the first to open a path in an unfamiliar place, so it went without saying how much energy she had used up. Although Hun Ku had Luo Fan's help to take over a part of the resistance, there was still a part of the resistance after all. Her own strength was the weakest, so her consumption would only be greater than that of the Space Maiden in the alternate timeline. It could be said that their current strength was at most 60% of the normal situation. Although this strength was still terrifying, it was obviously not at its peak. It couldn't adapt to the perfect requirements of Luo Fan and Air Maiden. Seeing that the two of them sat cross-legged and began to cultivate to recover their strength, Luo Fan nodded and began to create a secret art according to his previous idea, so that not only could he change his body structure, but also Hun Ku and Air Maiden's body structure. With his own body as a reference, the difficulty of creating such a secret art was greatly reduced for Luo Fan. However, even so, several days had passed by the time he was finally able to complete the creation. It's finally done. On this day, Luo Fan's eyes lit up and such a thought flashed through his mind. At this moment there was an additional secret art in his mind. This part of the incantation was not complicated. There were only about 300 words, but each word contained an extremely profound truth. It could be said that each word was a gem, and each word was mysterious. When each word was extended, it could become thousands upon thousands of words. In other words, if these 300 or so characters were to be expanded, the number of characters would be in the millions. Once again, he carefully examined this section of the incantation. After confirming that there were no mistakes, he began to slowly activate the mysterious power in his body. He began to operate this secret art. As the secret art was operated, his body began to gradually change. From his original appearance of flesh and blood, he gradually turned into a light man. This light man blended with the surrounding light and seemed to have become a part of the surrounding light. At first glance, it was almost indistinguishable. This change. It instantly woke up Hun Ku, who was recovering her cultivation, and Empty Maiden, who was in a different timeline. When they saw the change in Luo Fan's body, both of them were shocked. How is this possible? How can such a technique be created? Empty Maiden, who was in a different timeline, was no longer as calm as usual. She just muttered. She, who had long known about the origin of the laws, was well aware of the mysteries and profoundness contained within the origin of the laws. She didn't even hope that she could fully comprehend this mystery one day. Under such circumstances, he suddenly saw someone who had not only completely comprehended this profound mystery, but had also used this profound mystery to create a profound technique like an incarnation. One could imagine the frustration she felt. Luo Fan stopped the secret art at this moment. His body slowly changed from the state of the light man to the state of flesh and blood, returning to his normal state. It's still not perfect after all. After recovering, he sighed. Just now, he had indeed transformed into the same kind of existence as the origin of the natural order. However, during this process, he felt a faint pressure coming from the origin of the natural order. This kind of pressure pressed down on his body, pressed down on his mind, made him feel as if his body was being pressed down on countless worlds. This situation was very obvious. Although the technique had been created, the origin of the natural order was still different from the real origin of the natural order. However, the converted origin of the natural order was still different from the real origin of the natural order, so he couldn't fully integrate it. Although he knew this drawback, there was no way to improve it. Because the root of this weakness was that his world view of the natural order was still not truly perfect. His world view of the natural order was still different from the world view of the true sage level. In other words, as long as his world view of the natural order couldn't be upgraded to the true sage level, this weakness would definitely exist. After sighing in his heart for a while, Luo Fan recovered. Although there were still weaknesses, this was already in line with his requirement. That kind of pressure would oppress him, but it wouldn't really stop him from stepping into the origin of the natural order. Moreover, the consumption of moving forward wouldn't be too much. At the very least, compared to the method of using 3 fulcrums to support the origin of the natural order, the consumption of this method was at least 10,000 times less. Even for Hun Ku, this kind of consumption would only take a few days to recover. All kinds of thoughts flashed through his mind. Luo Fan turned to look at Hun Ku and the Empty Maiden in a different timeline. At this time, the two of them had already stopped adjusting their breath. "Have you fully recovered?" Luo Fan asked. Both of them nodded at this time, but they didn't speak. The Empty Maiden in a different timeline was frustrated and had no interest in speaking, but Hun Ku was waiting for her to speak. "Well then, this is the method I thought of. I think you can see where my method is, right?" Luo Fan said with a smile. As he spoke, 2 spiritual lights appeared in his hands and rushed toward the empty maiden and Hun Ku in a different timeline. In the blink of an eye, they were already in front of them. The 2 specks of spiritual light contained the more than 300 words of the spell. However, Space Maiden and Hun Ku, who were in a different timeline, took half a day to finish reading the over 300 words. Every word was light to Luo Fan, without the slightest bit of weight. However, for the 2 of them, every word seemed to be a part of the world. It was so heavy that they had to go all out to receive it in order to be able to draw it into their hearts. Every time they received a word, they would need to rest for a while before they could recover and continue with the next one. In this way, it took them half a day to receive the more than 300 words. As soon as they received the more than 300 words, they sat down cross-legged in the air without hesitation and closed their eyes to comprehend this method. They carefully experienced the endless mysteries within it. Spots of spiritual light were slowly released from their bodies. They were pulsating slightly as if they were inhaling and exhaling. During the process of creating the method, Luo Fan had already consulted their strength and cultivation path. Their strength and might naturally wouldn't be an obstacle in cultivating this method. Therefore, in just a few days, their bodies gradually began to emit a light that was extremely similar to the light around them. As the light emitted, the light around them seemed to have found a partner and began to entangle their bodies continuously. Gradually, an indescribable resonance was formed with the light on their bodies. This resonance was the key to the cultivation of this technique. As the resonance occurred, the light emitted from their bodies gradually changed and transformed as if it had found a template and began to gradually transform into the light around them. Chapter 19:12. In this process of evolution, the light on their bodies became purer and purer, and the difference between them and the surrounding light became smaller and smaller. Gradually, there was a feeling of blending. This process continued without end. After a few days, their bodies had gradually transformed into the light. The light that was originally emitted from their bodies had unknowingly turned into the main body of their bodies, becoming the root of their bodies. Luo Fan watched this scene from the side with a faint smile on his face. He did not disturb them, nor did he give them any pointers. He just watched their bodies gradually evolve and change. After a few more days, an inexplicable tremor emanated from the 2 of them. This tremor was extremely mysterious. It stirred up the surroundings and formed light vortexes. It was as if the surrounding light had really turned into an ocean of seawater. After this tremor, Hun Ku and the Space Maiden from a different timeline had completely turned into 2 light figures. 2 light figures that seemed to have the same nature as the surrounding light and the light emitted by the origin of the natural order in front of them. It was obvious that they had completely mastered the cultivation technique that Luo Fan had previously passed on to them. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan smiled slightly and said, "It seems that you have succeeded. This feeling is wonderful," the Space Maiden from a different timeline said at this moment. There was an inexplicable sense of dread in her words, as if she was immersed in an extremely unfamiliar realm. This was indeed the case. Turning into this state of light figure was equivalent to integrating into the origin of the natural order in front of her and becoming a part of it. What her heart felt and what her body touched were the truths and mysteries contained in the origin of the natural order. However, these principles and profundities were obviously not completely equivalent to her own path of cultivation. Therefore, entering this realm was equivalent to sinking into a completely unfamiliar realm. She felt a completely unfamiliar cultivation path. "Yeah, I feel like my existence has expanded countless times," Hun Ku said at this moment. This is the feeling of the origin of the natural order. However, this feeling is ultimately different from your own cultivation path. "It's best if you don't confuse it," said Luo Fan with a smile. "Of course not," Hun Ku replied sternly. The air maid in the alternate timeline didn't say anything. Hun Ku still needed Luo Fan's guidance, But the level of this air hostess from an alternate timeline was not much different from his. How could she not see through him? Why would he need Luo Fan's guidance? Naturally, there was no need to reply to his nonsense. Naturally, Luo Fan's warning was directed at Hun Ku, not the emptiness girl from a different timeline. However, he did not mind her reaction. With a faint smile, he said, "Then let's begin. After waiting for so long, I can finally see the truth of that power." As he spoke, his body gradually began to glow. Not long after, his body had turned into a light figure that was almost one with the light of the origin of the natural order. This kind of speed and ease was worlds apart from the strenuous effort displayed by Hun Ku and Empty Lady in an alternate timeline, however. Hun Ku and Empty Lady in an alternate timeline, who had already seen how incredible Luo Fan was, didn't show any surprise at this time. They just nodded and followed Luo Fan, slowly stepping into the origin of the natural order. As the three of them stepped in, the depths of the natural order regained its calmness. In the depths of the origin of the natural order, there was an unprecedented liveliness and clamor that was the pressure of the origin of the natural order on the light figure. At this time, it was also affecting the three of them. "Unfortunately, my strength is still not enough to completely eliminate this pressure," Luo Fan sighed and explained when he saw the slightly strained expression on Hun Ku and Empty Lady's faces. "This is already incredible. I originally thought that this pressure would be 100 times stronger than this. I didn't expect you to be able to weaken it to this extent. It seems that I still underestimated you and overestimated myself." Empty Lady in an alternate timeline sighed at this time. As for Hun Ku, she no longer had the strength to speak at this time. She could only follow closely behind her parents and try not to fall behind as much as possible. From the outside, the origin of the natural order was just a ball of light. However, due to the fact that it contained the source of boundless laws and laws, time and space had turned into a completely different and mysterious state within it. This mysterious feeling caused them to feel as if they had stepped into another universe, another world. Their surroundings were filled with endless spacetime, and if they wanted to rush to a certain location, they would have to pass through the endless spacetime in order to reach it. This wasn't a big obstacle for the three of them, but it was enough to consume a lot of their time. In the endless light, the three of them kept moving in a certain direction. Around them, countless rays of light constantly evolved and revealed all kinds of indescribable forms. It was as if an infinite fantasy was entangled around the three of them. These countless rays of light formed special forms. They were either heaven and earth, space, living beings, or all kinds of creatures. Almost as long as they could think of it, they could find it. Under such circumstances, he felt as if he was constantly advancing in a dream, and there was a mysterious feeling emanating from him. They kept moving forward like this. In the end, it took them nearly 10 years before they finally discovered some changes in front of them. Even though they had turned into light figures, the speed of the three of them was still extremely shocking. It could even be said that it was close to defying the natural order. Normally speaking, hundreds of millions of light years was just a matter of a few blinks of an eye for them. Under such circumstances, they had traveled at such a speed for a full 10 years. It went without saying how terrifying the distance they had traveled was. The scale of the scene that the origin of the natural order had evolved was indescribable. "It's here. I'm finally here." At this moment, Empty Lady in an alternate timeline let out a long breath and said. In front of them was a place that seemed to exist but didn't seem to exist. It was there. He could faintly sense everything, including the state of chaos. Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. He raised his hand and gently touched the place in front of him. His tentacles felt extremely hard. It seemed that even if he used all his strength, he wouldn't be able to move it at all. At this moment, Luo Fan knew. Based on the light figure's state, it was impossible to step into that place at all. At least, it was completely impossible to walk in directly like this. How do you plan to go in? Luo Fan asked with a frown. Empty Lady in an alternate timeline must know something, which was why she dared to challenge here. Moreover, even if Empty Lady in an alternate timeline thought of a method where the three of them turned into three fulcrums to push open this place, it definitely wouldn't work on the place in front of them. They wouldn't be able to push open it and allow the three of them to step into it. In this way, obviously, Empty Lady in an alternate timeline must have made some special preparations. That was why she was confident that she could enter that place. I have this. The Empyrean who was in a different timeline took out a stone from an unknown hidden space. This stone was extremely strange. Not only was the material Luo Fan had never seen or thought of, but its shape was also something he had never seen before. Unexpectedly, it also contained endless mysteries. Every rise and fall, every bump, every scratch, and every material distribution seemed to compress all the mysteries of the universe and fuse them into it. Such a stone. Apart from everything else, its appearance alone could be said to be a priceless treasure. If its image was transmitted into a world without any cultivation world, it would probably be enough to build a cultivation civilization that could even give birth to existences like the Supreme Emperor. This is your adventure? Luo Fan suddenly came to a realization. This is just one of my adventures. Empty Lady in an alternate timeline smiled and said, in fact, the reason why I was able to travel back then was because I coincidentally obtained this stone during the Age Destruction. It's because I coincidentally obtained this stone during the Era Destruction that I was able to borrow the power of the Era Destruction to traverse the primal chaos and come to this world. After that, it was also because of it that I was able to cultivate to this level in the fragment of the big world. What a great stone! Luo Fan finally couldn't help but exclaim in admiration. He couldn't imagine what kind of existence a stone that could allow people to travel through chaos was. At the very least, with his current worldview, his current accumulation of knowledge, and his current understanding of cultivation, he couldn't understand the existence of such a level at all. So, you're saying that you're also relying on this stone to sense the existence of that power? Luo Fan asked again. Empty Lady in an alternate timeline nodded and said, yes, that's right. Now that you've taken it out, it's obvious that you've found a way to step into the place where the power is from this stone? Luo Fan asked again. Empty Lady in an alternate timeline nodded at this moment. After nodding, she just looked at Luo Fan as if she wanted to see what he was going to do. Seeing that, Luo Fan smiled and said, you're not worried that I'll snatch this stone away, are you? Empty Lady in an alternate timeline nodded without any disguise and said, of course. Since the beginning of my travel, I've taken this stone out 327 times. Among them, there were 326 times when my fellow Taoists who saw this stone turned hostile and wanted to snatch it away. It's perfectly normal for you to turn hostile and snatch it away. Oh? 327 times. There were 326 times when my fellow Taoists turned hostile. In that case, the remaining time... Luo Fan was curious. As he spoke, he suddenly understood and turned to look at Hun Ku who was beside him. Empty Lady in an alternate timeline smiled and said, it seems like you've guessed it. That's right, the only one who didn't turn hostile is her. I see. No wonder you cared so much about it before. Luo Fan suddenly sighed. This kind of treasure, which seemed to be even more precious than the primal origin spiritual treasure, was so attractive to cultivators that it was enough to make any cultivator go crazy. Under such circumstances, no one would be able to remain unmoved in the face of such a treasure. Moreover, being able to hold back the desire in one's heart and not turn hostile meant that the friendship between the two parties was more important than the treasure. If one could meet such a friend, it would be a lifetime of luck. Obviously, according to what Empty Lady in an alternate timeline said, the original Hun Jing was obviously such a friend. How about it? Since you've already gotten the answer, why don't you make your move? Empty lady in an alternate timeline said with a smile. Her eyes were filled with probing expectation and even determination. It was as if she was certain that Luo Fan would make his move, but she was looking forward to how he would do it. She was trying to figure out what method he would use. What kind of existence was Luo Fan? He naturally saw through her thoughts at a glance. Suddenly, he laughed. You're so confident. It seems that you have a trump card. Let me guess, there seems to be your brand on that treasure. Although it's only a conceptual attachment, you should be able to mobilize the power of this treasure. This should be what you're relying on, right? Luo Fan said with a smile. As he spoke, he raised his hand and rubbed it, as if he was rubbing something. At this moment, Empty Lady in an alternate timeline's expression suddenly changed. She suddenly felt that the imprint that she had attached to the stone was suddenly being caressed by an invisible hand. The invisible hand itself was completely untraceable, but it revealed a kind of determination and toughness. It seemed that as long as it exerted a bit of force, it could easily crush and destroy her brand. Once the imprint was crushed and destroyed, then the connection between the stone and her would be completely severed. At that time, the stone would be completely destroyed. She would no longer have any ability to resist in front of Luo Fan. A kind of terror emerged in her heart. The rubbing of the invisible power combined with the movement of Luo Fan's hand at this moment. How could she not understand that the source of the invisible hand was Luo Fan, who was standing in front of her at this moment, her Taoist companion in an alternate timeline? How is this possible? No one has ever been able to find the location of my brand. Empty Lady in an alternate timeline could not help but exclaim. I'm not someone else. My fate is even more complicated and mysterious than yours. Even more complicated and mysterious than you. Luo Fan just smiled. As for his understanding of concepts, when he first entered the incomplete perfect world, he had already gained an unimaginable deep understanding with the help of the characteristics of the world itself. Now, his understanding of concepts was not only thousands of times stronger than that of Empty Lady in an alternate timeline, but also thousands of times stronger than that of other living beings below the true divine level. In front of such a person, what was there to rely on for the imprint that was attached to the concept? Naturally, it was easily controlled by him. At this moment, Empty Lady in an alternate timeline looked as if she had lost her parents. Her eyes were full of despair. It seems that I have underestimated you after all. What are you waiting for? Do it, she said with a determined look. Hearing this, Luo Fan just smiled and slowly withdrew the invisible power that rubbed the concept brand. He put down his palm and said, When did I say I wanted to do it? You have always been the one who said I wanted to do it, right? Hearing this, Empty Lady in an alternate timeline was stunned. What? You don't want to do it? Then, she suddenly became vigilant. Don't tell me that you think I'm in another timeline? In another timeline, she was naturally Luo Fan's Taoist companion. Obviously, she said this because she thought that Luo Fan did it because of his feelings for her. Luo Fan did not know whether to laugh or cry. He said, What are you thinking? How could I confuse the two of you? Then why are you not tempted by this treasure? Don't you know that this is a treasure that is more precious than a true divine treasure? Not only is it powerful, but it may also reflect the mysteries of the realms above the true divine. No matter what cultivation path you practice, it will be of great significance to you. The Empty Lady in the alternate timeline said with a frown. Maybe it is so for you. But for me, it is just a treasure that can randomly pass through a chaotic state. For me, it is not much help for my cultivation. It is not worth it for me to snatch it from others. Luo Fan just said lightly. I think you are crazy. Empty Lady in an alternate timeline said disdainfully. However, although the disdain on her face was unprecedentedly strong, for some reason, it gave Luo Fan a sense of closeness. It was as if some obstacle that hindered the development of their relationship had been removed. Maybe I am really crazy. Luo Fan did not care about her saying that he was crazy. He just smiled and said, "The definition of insanity was insanity, a mental disorder." It did not seem inappropriate to use this on existences who had already established their own unique worldview. Mortals who were crazy and mentally ill were existences who lived in their own world. Although this was on a different level, it did not seem to be much different from existences who had established their own worldview. "Daddy, Mommy, are you all right?" Hun Ku asked cautiously at this moment. Luo Fan and Empty Lady in an alternate timeline looked at each other and suddenly smiled. However, neither of them answered Hun Ku's question. In fact, Hun Ku did not need their answer. She was not a childish little girl. As a powerful celestial emperor, she naturally had her own judgment. The current performance of Luo Fan and Empty Lady in an alternate timeline was the best answer for her. What else was there to say? To be continued. Chapter 1913. Since the grudge in their hearts had been removed, the next thing to do was to work together to open up the place where the power was. Originally, I planned to use you as an offering to activate the power of this treasure to open up this place. Unfortunately, that method won't work anymore. I'll have to think of a new way, the Empyrean from an alternate timeline said. Hearing this, Luo Fan could only smile and say, "Then we can only think of another way. I don't have the noble integrity to sacrifice myself." The Air Maiden in the alternate timeline frowned. The stone in her hand slowly floated up and began to spin. At this moment, the image of the stone also began to undergo an extremely subtle and mysterious change. This kind of subtle and mysterious change caused all the details on the stone to seem to come alive. At first glance, it seemed as if all the mysteries and principles on the stone were evolving. What a mysterious treasure! Looking at this scene, even Luo Fan couldn't help but exclaim in admiration. At this moment, the light around the stone stirred and began to distort gradually. After a short while, it turned into an indescribable light shadow that shrouded the stone. It was as if the light shadow had been taken by the stone and turned into a part of the stone, separated from the surrounding origin of the rules. During this process of change, Luo Fan could faintly sense an inexplicable resonance between the stone and the mysterious place in front of them. This resonance, like inhaling and exhaling, it caused the stone to undergo subtle changes. It also caused the mysterious place to undergo subtle changes. All we need to do is wait. At this moment, Luo Fan had already seen through something and sighed. The birth of this resonance clearly indicated that the stone should be connected to that power on a certain level, and the existence of this connection. This was already enough for that mysterious existence to open a path for them and guide them in. Therefore, at this moment, as long as the resonance continued, this mysterious place would naturally open up and construct a path for them to pass through, allowing the three of them to step into it. However, at the same time, he also saw through it. Although it would be fine as long as they waited, the waiting time would probably be relatively long. Perhaps we can use our strength to reduce this waiting time. The Air Maiden in the alternate timeline said with uncertainty. Or perhaps our strength will trigger a violent backlash from this treasure and erase us completely. After that, they will completely erase us, Luo Fan said faintly. This possibility wasn't non-existent and wasn't even considered small. Hearing this, the Air Maiden in the alternate timeline smiled and said, "If this was the first time I saw this treasure, it would naturally be possible. But now I've obtained this treasure for who knows how many billions of years. If I let this happen again, then all my years of cultivation would have been in vain. I almost forgot that you already have a way to sacrifice me in exchange for the power of this treasure." Luo Fan let out a sigh. At this moment, the Air Maiden in the alternate timeline had no intention of replying at all. Countless streams of light poured down from her eyes, which were densely packed with unknown runes and talismans that constantly flickered. Vaguely, waves of mysterious profundities continuously leaked out from them. Clearly, even though she had grasped this treasure for countless years, it was still difficult for her to help this treasure resonate with that power. She needed to properly think of a way to do so. At this moment, Luo Fan no longer paid attention to her and turned his head to look at the mysterious place in front of him. As his mentality continued to change, the inexplicable place in his eyes gradually changed as well. Perhaps this is a door that is tightly locked, preventing us from entering. After an unknown amount of time, a thought appeared in his mind. The moment this thought appeared in his mind, he suddenly felt the mysterious scene in front of him rapidly change. In the blink of an eye, it had turned into a huge stone door. The stone door was tightly shut, and there were countless mysterious patterns on it that covered the door from top to bottom, inside and outside, and judging from the material, it vaguely felt like the material of the stone that the Air Maiden in the alternate timeline was holding. Looking at the earth-shattering scene in front of him, Luo Fan was shocked at first, but then he came to a sudden realization. This situation was because the thought that had just appeared was extremely close to the essence of that inexplicable existence. As a result, the moment he had this thought, he had naturally triggered some kind of mysterious existence, causing that inexplicable existence in his eyes to undergo such a huge change. Perhaps seeing the precious stone in the Space Maiden's hand was also one of the reasons. The moment the mysterious place in front of him turned into a door, the resonance between the mysterious place and the stone suddenly increased by many times. In an instant, a thin crack appeared between the two tightly shut doors. "What's going on?" the Air Maiden in the alternate timeline exclaimed at this moment. Obviously, such a change had already exceeded her expectations, and had completely exceeded the limits of her control. "I haven't done anything yet, why did the resonance suddenly increase?" She looked at Luo Fan in surprise. There were only 3 people here, apart from her, Hun Ku, and Luo Fan. Since she didn't do anything, the one who was most likely to do something was, of course, Luo Fan. Although she didn't know what exactly Luo Fan did, at this moment, Luo Fan just smiled. "Isn't this a good thing?" "It is indeed a good thing. But, how did you do it?" the Air Maiden in the alternate timeline asked with an extremely surprised expression. Hearing this, Luo Fan just smiled and pointed with his finger. A bit of spiritual light rushed out of his hand towards Hun Ku and the Air Maiden in the alternate timeline. Both of their eyes lit up. In the blink of an eye. Then, he caught the spiritual light. They didn't know why Luo Fan was able to suddenly increase the resonance. Obviously, they were very concerned about it and wanted to understand. There wasn't much information contained in the spiritual light. And this information was similar to the information that the Air Maiden in the alternate timeline had transmitted to Luo Fan. However, it was also a kind of concept-establishing information. The existence or non-existence of something was a kind of concept. The form of something was also a kind of concept. Since it was a kind of concept, naturally, it could be established by concept-establishing methods. As the two of them accepted the concept of the door, they also accepted that the material of the door was extremely similar to the treasure that surpassed the primordial origin spiritual treasure. The resonance between the stone and the door increased by countless times. Squeaking sounds began to gradually come from the door. The 2 sides of the door, which originally only had a slight crack, began to slowly open at a speed visible to the naked eye. Gradually, an indescribable light was revealed behind the door, a light that seemed to be in a state of chaos. "It's actually this simple," Hun Ku murmured. The divine light in her eyes was incomparably dazzling. An indescribable anticipation and excitement emanated from the depths of her eyes. "This isn't a simple matter." The Air Maiden in the alternate timeline looked at this scene and sighed. It seemed to be just a change of perspective, but in fact, it involved the understanding of the root of cultivation, the root of heaven and earth. It was already at a level that she couldn't understand. If she hadn't reached that level, she wouldn't have been able to see through the inexplicable essence of that inexplicable existence before she understood its mysteries, let alone reach the point where she could influence that inexplicable existence. At this point, she was finally completely convinced by Luo Fan. It seems that in another 2 or 3 days, the door should be completely open, Luo Fan said with a smile. Hun Ku and the Air Maiden in the alternate timeline nodded and watched the entire process of the door slowly opening. The inexplicable existence was just a door, so it was self-evident what the process of the door slowly opening represented. It was easy to imagine how profound the principles and profundities contained within it were. It was a great opportunity to watch the entire process. The Air Maiden and Hun Ku in the alternate timeline were well aware of this. How could they let go of this opportunity so easily? 3 days passed in a flash. For Luo Fan, who could equate 100 trillion years to an instant, this period of time was no different from any other time period. However, for the Air Maiden and Hun Ku in the alternate timeline, these 3 days were just like an instant. They even felt that 3 days had passed when they looked at the door, and the door was completely open. What exactly is inside? This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind as he slowly walked towards the door. Although Hun Ku and the Air Maiden who had just woken up wanted to continue, they knew what they had to do. At this moment, they followed behind Luo Fan and walked towards the door. After passing through the door, Luo Fan and the Air Maiden in the alternate timeline felt like they had passed through a boundless chaotic state. This feeling was incomparably familiar to the two of them, causing them to feel an indescribable sense of shock for a moment. For Luo Fan, this feeling couldn't be clearer. He had experienced the process of stepping into another perfect world from one side of the perfect world several times. He had even experienced the feeling of stepping into a big world many times. The feeling of passing through the chaotic state had long been engraved in his heart. He was extremely familiar with this feeling and took it for granted. Although the Air Maiden in the alternate timeline didn't have as rich an experience as him, she had also traveled from the Earth universe to this big world. In addition, she had drifted in the chaotic state for a long time after the big world was shattered. The feeling of passing through the chaotic state was also extremely deep for her. This feeling was extremely familiar and took it for granted. In contrast, although Hun Ku had traveled through time in her previous life, she had completely lost that memory. Therefore, this feeling was completely unfamiliar to her. In his heart, however, he was only shocked by this indescribable feeling. The surrounding light and shadow kept changing. Everything was gray. It spread out in front of them until the end of their sight and the end of their senses. Under their feet, there was a faintly discernible light. Behind them, there was only one door. This door was almost exactly the same as the one they saw outside, but it showed a sense of normalcy that shouldn't have appeared here. Through this door, they could see the light of the origin of the rule behind it. The Air Maiden in the alternate timeline was holding a stone in her hand. At this moment, it emitted a layer of invisible light. It pushed away the surrounding grayness, causing a vacuum of about 30 feet around them to appear. This allowed the three of them to be free from the influence of the surrounding grayness. The sense has been strengthened. Luo Fan suddenly opened his mouth and said these words. What sense has been strengthened? The Air Maiden in the alternate timeline was stunned and asked. The sense with my main body has been strengthened. Luo Fan sighed and said again. At this moment, his eyes were filled with confusion, hesitation, and indescribable shock. Your main body doesn't seem to be in this world. It doesn't seem to be in this world. Space Maiden, who was in a different timeline, also had an inexplicable look of astonishment on her face, as she vaguely thought of something. Hun Ku asked with a puzzled look, Dad, Mom, what are you talking about? Why can't I understand at all? Luo Fan sighed and said, I once heard from a creature in another perfect world that between the many perfect worlds and the great worlds, there is a kind of transportation network established by a true sage. This transportation network is spread all over the chaos. As long as you step on it, you can travel between many perfect worlds and big worlds. Could it be that this is that kind of transportation network? Hun-Ku seemed to have woken up from a dream and exclaimed. According to the current situation, combined with the few words I heard at the beginning, this place may be that kind of transportation network. Luo Fan sighed. As he spoke, he moved a little closer to the Air Maiden in the alternate timeline and warned, "Don't leave the protection of this treasure. If this is really that transportation network, there will be endless pressure and impact on the road. Once I leave the protection, even I won't be able to hold on for long and will fall into the road. And below is the universe of negative emotions. Once you fall into it, you will never be able to reincarnate." Hearing this, the Air Maiden and Hun-Ku in the alternate timeline couldn't help but tremble. They didn't expect the surroundings to be so dangerous. Didn't we chase after that power to come here? Then, where's that power? Hun-Ku asked carefully after trembling. Hearing this, Luo Fan frowned and said, "Maybe it's somewhere along the road. But now, it seems that it's not fated with us." He wasn't discouraged, but it was the truth. After all, they needed to rely on that treasure to protect them on the road. Once they left the protection, it was highly possible that they would never be able to reincarnate. Under such circumstances, how could they talk about finding the thing on the road and snatching it? "Are we moving?" the Air Maiden in the alternate timeline suddenly asked. Hearing this, Luo Fan and Hun-Ku's expressions changed slightly. The two of them sensed carefully, and in the end, Luo Fan sensed it clearly first. His expression changed drastically as he said, "That's right, we are indeed moving forward quickly." As he spoke, he turned around and discovered that the door behind them had disappeared without a trace at some point in time. Behind them, there was only the grayish, mysterious existence that seemed to be in a chaotic state. Just as he was about to say something, Hun-Ku exclaimed, "There's a fracture in front." Amidst their exclamations, they discovered that they had already arrived at the spot where the belt of light had broken off. In front of them, the belt of light had already been completely broken off. It extended for several feet before it was reconnected. Of course, several feet was only in Luo Fan's opinion. In fact, on this road, distance was meaningless. In other words, this distance seemed to be able to be crossed in a flash, but in fact there might be countless worlds and spacetimes in it, and it was impossible to cross it. Fortunately, the force that kept them moving forward did not continue to take effect here. Therefore, they stopped in front of the fracture, lest they left the road and fell into the boundless universe of negative emotions. "How do we go back?" the Air Maiden in the alternate timeline asked. At this moment, she was already a little out of her wits. "Go back? We don't have the right to go back now." Luo Fan sighed. "With our current abilities, even with the protection of this treasure, we can only continue to move forward until we reach the end of this path and see what kind of power or what kind of heaven and earth it is. Why can't we go back?" Hun-Ku was a little anxious. Luo Fan and the Air Maiden in the alternate timeline might not care much about whether they could go back or not. After all, cultivation was still cultivation. However, Hun-Ku was different. In the previous world, she was a celestial emperor. She was an existence that controlled the world. How could she bear to leave everything behind just like that? "Did you sense how we got here just now?" Luo Fan sighed and asked. Chapter 1914. At this moment, the empty maiden in the alternate timeline suddenly sensed something and her eyes widened. Luo Fan and Hun-Ku instantly noticed this abnormality. In an instant, both of them felt an inexplicable sense of anticipation and worry. After a while, the empty maiden in the alternate timeline suddenly raised her hand and pointed in a certain direction. She said, "I sense that power. It's in that direction." As she pointed, a fork suddenly appeared in that direction. In other words, the belt of light beneath their feet suddenly branched off into another tributary, heading in the direction she had pointed out. "I see." At this moment, Luo Fan came to a sudden realization and understood what was going on. As a matter of fact, the paths in the state of chaos all had mysterious characteristics, which were similar to the gap between heaven and earth and the state of chaos, as well as the characteristics of the origin of the natural order. It was a characteristic that wouldn't exist without the concept of its existence. In other words, it seemed like there was only one path that went straight ahead, without any tributaries or forks. All of this was because it was what they knew. In fact, there might be hundreds, thousands, or even tens of thousands of forks in the path that they had passed. In fact, even the broken path in front of them at this moment and the endless abyss below the broken path might not be an abyss itself. Instead, there might be a path, and there might even be many paths that were connected here. It was just that, in their understanding, those paths didn't exist. That was why they weren't revealed just now. Just as he thought of this, the abyss in front of him suddenly started to change. The abyss turned into a misty brilliance. The misty brilliance couldn't be seen through at all. It completely covered the abyss below and made it impossible to see how many paths there were in the light fog and where they led in every direction. Obviously, Luo Fan thought of that just now. He had established some preliminary concepts of the paths. However, this concept was still extremely vague, and he still couldn't have a clear understanding of the transportation network in front of him. This was why he couldn't see the fog in front of him at all, and he couldn't see the road behind the fog. Unfortunately, my knowledge is still too shallow. Luo Fan sighed in his heart. Following this sigh, he discovered that the surrounding light and shadows had suddenly changed. At some unknown time, the fog of light had already disappeared. Their surroundings had returned to their original state. Their surroundings were still the same gray haze, and beneath their feet, there was still only a band of light within a radius of 30 feet. The glowing fog and the fork in the road had completely disappeared. Obviously, under the protection of the treasure, they were actually able to subdue the three of them. In an incomprehensible way, he once again advanced. Based on what the air hostess in the alternate timeline sensed, they were heading in the right direction. Clearly, it was the fork that had appeared just now and pointed directly in the direction of that power. After advancing like this for an unknown period of time, they once again encountered a fracture. Perhaps he had encountered a certain node. This node also had the appearance of a glowing fog, and it also caused them to stop here. Everything around them seemed to be the same as the previous node from a long time ago. After experiencing it once, their performance was much better than before. At this moment, the air hostess in the alternate timeline once again closed her eyes and sensed carefully. After sensing for a long time, she pointed in another direction. Following the direction she pointed, another fork appeared in that direction. Just like that, they kept moving and moving forward. In the end, after several hundred teleportations, they finally arrived at a certain location. There was no need for the air hostess in the alternate timeline to sense it. Even Luo Fan could already sense the existence of that power. With such a vast power, even a true saint is nothing compared to it, right? This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind as he stood on the road. At this moment, a platform appeared in front of them. The size of this platform was extremely strange. It seemed to be boundless and narrow. At the same time, it seemed to be infinitely narrow as it lay quietly at the end of the road. Around it there was an endless grayness, just like the two sides of the road. However, there was nothing on the platform. It was as if it was just an empty platform. However, in Luo Fan's senses, there was an indescribable vastness and power entrenched there. It seemed to be eternally motionless, but it also seemed to be constantly changing into billions of states. The reason why he couldn't see and could only sense this aura was also because he couldn't sense the path node earlier. In other words, he could not understand that power at all. He could not even establish a concept of the existence of that power. While they were in a daze, the three of them had already arrived at the edge of the platform. They appeared on the platform and were about to step onto it. At this moment, an indescribable feeling appeared in the three of them. At this moment, the three of them suddenly came to a realization. It turned out that they had finally stopped. Before this, they had been constantly moving forward at an unimaginable speed. Let's go. Luo Fan did not hesitate. He immediately lifted his foot and stepped onto the platform. No matter what kind of existence that power was, no matter what kind of effect it had, and no matter what kind of attitude it had towards the existence that touched it, since Luo Fan had already gone through untold hardships to come here, he naturally would not have any hesitation. In contrast, Hun Ku, an empty maiden from a different timeline, looked a little hesitant. However, they were not ordinary people after all. At this moment, they gritted their teeth and stepped onto the platform one by one. Just as the three of them stepped onto the platform, the view in their eyes began to change dramatically. The path behind them disappeared in an instant. The endless gray haze around the platform also disappeared in the blink of an eye. It had completely disappeared in the blink of an eye. It had transformed into a completely different form. It was as if there was originally a boundless fog, but now that the fog had dissipated, everything behind the fog was revealed. "What's going on?" Hun Ku murmured. Her eyes were filled with doubt, and her expression was extremely dull. She only knew how to use an indescribable gaze to look at the scene around the three of them at this moment. It was a vast expanse of darkness. In this darkness, there were densely packed clusters of stars. Among the stars, each dot was infinitely far away from this place. All the light almost blended into the darkness, making people think that they were seeing things and that they were seeing things. It was the same scene in all directions. There was no difference at all. What about that power? Suddenly, Hun Ku came back to her senses. Her expression was filled with bewilderment as she asked. "We are within that power." At this moment Luo Fan sighed. In his words, it was as if he had suddenly found the root of all his problems and the answer to all his doubts. At this moment, he looked at the clusters of stars around him that had almost blended into the darkness, and endless information flashed through his mind. Even his worldview spontaneously underwent all kinds of subtle adjustments at this moment. This kind of adjustment was something that even he couldn't understand. All kinds of changes. Some were just changes in the order, while some were just changes in the expression. At first glance, there seemed to be no difference from the original. However, after these adjustments, he keenly felt that his worldview seemed to have become more perfect. This change made him realize that he was currently in a state where he was under the influence of an indescribable power. Coupled with the changes in the surrounding scenery, it was obvious that they had already fallen into that power. Everything they saw and sensed now was through that power. Those should be the many worlds in the chaos. Space Maiden, who was in a different timeline, was also a little startled. She seemed to be muttering to herself. "No, it's not the many worlds. It should be the countless fragments left behind after the previous world shattered," Luo Fan said at this moment. As soon as he said that, the countless stars around them began to quickly brighten, and each star began to gradually expand. In the end, they turned into moons that hung around them, making them feel as if they were enveloped by countless moons. It was an indescribable romance. This change didn't just happen in his perspective, but it was really happening around him. In other words, be it Space Maiden or Hun Ku, they could clearly see the changes around them. At this moment, both of them were shocked, and Hun Ku couldn't help but take a few steps back. However, it was only for a short while. Soon, they had completely recovered, and there was a kind of indescribable shock and excitement on their faces. They were shocked because they could see the countless fragments of the worlds in the chaos from this perspective. They were excited because this would definitely bring them endless benefits, and it would even be enough for them to make a huge breakthrough in their cultivation realm. It should be known that being able to see the world and the fragments in the chaos with one's own eyes was like suddenly having the perspective of a true divine, or even the perspective of an existence above a true divine. For an existence below a true divine, even a little bit of harvest would be enough to become a great resource for them to become a true divine. At this moment, Luo Fan wasn't very excited. At this moment, he just started to carefully distinguish the endless bright moons around him, which were almost as dazzling as the surface of the sun. This kind of bright moon was extremely mysterious and wonderful. As long as one sensed it carefully, one could feel the various deeply hidden auras contained in it. These auras, they were the auras of the worlds represented by these bright moons. As long as one could use these auras, one could naturally find out which bright moon was the world that they had just come out from. One could even speculate which world would collide with which world fragment next, and what kind of tribulation would be triggered. The number of bright moons was simply too many. Moreover, at first glance, there didn't seem to be any difference. Under such circumstances, it was extremely difficult to specifically find the bright moon that one was looking for. Needless to say, even if it was Luo Fan. However, it took him what felt like 100 years to grasp a trace of it. As he locked his gaze on the bright moon hidden behind the many bright moons, the surrounding light and shadow started to change again. The bright moon hidden behind the bright moon moved forward quickly, gradually bringing along the countless bright moons around it, causing the rotation of all the bright moons to undergo either small or huge changes. Gradually, the bright moon turned into the center of the countless bright moons around it. It became the center of the countless moons around it, causing the countless moons to revolve around it like stars revolving around the sun. Luo Fan's heart moved again, and the bright moon in the center started to gradually change. From the state of the bright moon, gradually it turned into the appearance of a world. This world wasn't considered big in the void, but it was so detailed that one could even see the countless small living creatures that existed in that world. At this moment, boom, 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 a thunderous sound was heard from that world. This sound contained endless information and even contained mysteries that Luo Fan couldn't distinguish. It was extremely familiar to Luo Fan, as it was the language of the world's will. Come back under the effect of that inexplicable power, the language that he originally couldn't understand converged into a sentence that he could understand and finally expressed this meaning. What is this? At this moment, Air Maiden and Hun Ku, who were in a different timeline, held their heads at the same time, as if their heads were going to explode in the next moment. Above their heads, countless rays of light spurted out like a fountain. The scene was extremely shocking and horrifying. When Luo Fan saw this, he knew that this was caused by the translation of the language of the world's will because they couldn't withstand the power. If it was purely the language of the world's will, it would just be a rumbling thunder in their ears. It wouldn't even be possible for it to penetrate their hearts, so naturally, it wouldn't affect them much. Under the translation of that power, these words were transformed into information that they could receive, into mysteries that they could understand. This naturally drilled into their ears and hearts without holding anything back. It was organized by their minds and transformed into words that they could understand. However, it was obvious that they, who had no such experience at all, were more accustomed to unreservedly understanding and receiving the information without leaving out any details. They were unable to understand this information from a macro level, and were unable to accept this information from a higher perspective. In this way, the information naturally brought them endless pressure. In the end, the information broke through their minds and gushed out. As for the pain they were feeling now, it was just a side effect of the process. Although he could tell what they were going through, Luo Fan could only watch helplessly. He couldn't alleviate their pain at all. After all, their current state was caused by receiving too much information and too many mysteries. Under such circumstances, everything in the outside world was already meaningless to them. Even if Luo Fan had a way to teach them to grasp the big picture and ignore the small picture, and to understand the information from a macro perspective, it was impossible for him to transmit it to their hearts. If he tried to do that, he might even be impacted by the information and drag himself down with him. Fortunately, although this scene seemed horrifying, it was ultimately only painful for them and not fatal. Luo Fan watched for a while before letting it go. The world's will must be summoning me back. After shifting his attention away from Hun Ku and Empty Lady, Luo Fan began to think about what the world's will had said. The way the world's will thought was something that no living being could understand. In other words, the world's will could be seen as not having the emotions and thoughts of living beings. Therefore, the world's will clearly couldn't be summoning them back, because it felt that they were the world's children. It must be because the world needed them to return. But why? As his thoughts spun, doubts arose in Luo Fan's heart again. Subconsciously, he looked at the world in the center. In an instant, his perspective changed slightly. The countless moons in the light and shadow changed one by one. Some of them turned into heaven and earth, some turned into planets, some turned into space-time, and some even turned into a strange void. This was clearly what he had just built. The countless moons were the effects of the concept of the countless fragment. As his perspective changed, he was slightly stunned. This was because he suddenly realized that beside the world that he was most familiar with, there was another world that was slightly smaller than that world, and it was constantly approaching that world. This is a fragment of another world, and after evolution, it has also become a perfect world. If we crash into it like this, thinking of this, even Luo Fan's heart could not help but tremble.